Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Week 6 and Week 7 overview and analysis video. This is going to be a big one, that I can definitely promise. We have 23 best of threes to go over in today's video. There are so many games to cover that I really do not want to waste your time, but this is the final week of the regular season. There's so much to talk about in terms of how things are breaking down, what teams are, in a good position going into playoffs and play-ins, and what teams I am much more concerned about in terms of how they finished off the split. So much to discuss, but we have to get into it because this video is already going to be mammoth in length. If you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below, but let's get into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. I am going to be doing some, award callouts at the end of the video to be determined on whether or not those will have graphics up on the screen. If they do, that's fantastic. Stick around for that. If they don't, you'll just have to take my word for it. We are trying to get this video out as quickly as possible, so I hope you can excuse the fact that not everything is going to be perfect here today, but we will still have everything, in a row in terms of all of our opinions. So don't worry about, the takes. The takes will definitely be in the video, but without further ado, let's get into it. We've got so much to go over. Let's start with week number 6, and kicking off day number 1 of week number 6 was a Group Ascend matchup between Weibo Gaming and FunPlus Phoenix, where Weibo Gaming are going to pick up the easy 2-0 victory. Probably should have stated this at the beginning of the video as well, but I'm going to try to be a bit quicker in terms of the analysis per series. Sometimes I say that and it does not work out. I'm a yapper. You guys know I'm a yapper. I have, basically hours upon hours upon hours of content on this channel. So just a little bit of a warning, if I talk about teams at least individually a little bit less, that might be the reason why, but I'll hit on the big notes. And for Weibo, the big notes in this series are pretty positive. Most of what they showed was just pretty good. I think game 1 was excellent from them. They absolutely demolished that first game. Game 2 was a bit of a banger. There were moments where it felt like Jiachi could actually take over on the Kaisa, or Kara was actually in a decent position on the Ari as well to play off of the Nocturne, but they just didn't have the firepower to keep up with Weibo. Jiachi had a terrible final fight despite having all the gold, and that meant that there was no win for FPX in sight. Player of the series is obviously going to go to Breathe. I don't think I really considered anyone else for this, mostly for the Yorick game in game 2. Yorick is kind of making a resurgence in multiple different regions right now. The one thing I will say about Yorick is the same thing I've said about him throughout the entirety of the year. You have to be the better team in order for Yorick to look like a competent pick. If you are worse, especially if you're worse macro-wise and at playing the map, Yorick's going to look like a complete bait pick. It's not going to work out under any circumstance, but if you can get it onto someone like Breathe, who's a very experienced and calculated top laner on a team like Weibo going up against the weakest team in Group Ascend, things do start to feel a lot easier for that team. So, credit to Breathe. I think he looked excellent there. The Gwen was pretty good in game number 1 as well. Other players to shout out, most of Weibo, but really the bot lane, I think, stepped up here today. Light was really consistent. I think this is the version of Light that, we had become accustomed to over the past couple of years. We've not really seen it at all over the course of 2025. I've been very critical of Light. I do not think he's even been good as an AD carry this year. I think he's been below average in terms of all LPL ADCs. There are a couple of players in Group Nirvana that I think have performed better than Light over the course of this year, which is not really something I expected to say, but this is definitely much more vintage, where he doesn't really need to be a main character. He can just be useful in a lot of team fights on things like Sivir and Xayah. Crisp was excellent as an engaged threat. Spoiler alert for the rest of this video. Crisp had a pretty excellent end to the regular season here. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep that up, because I really like Crisp as a player. Super inconsistent, is going to have bad games every once in a while, but still one of the more creative engage finders in the entire world. Maybe not quite where he was at his peak, but him and Tien, I think, are starting to reestablish that chemistry. Tien was really solid here. IYY, a jungler for FPX that they never really wanted to be a long-term solution. They bring Milky Way back at the beginning of the split. Everything goes down off the rift with Milky Way in terms of the scandal with him, so IYY is back in, but, spoiler alert, he also will not be here by the end of the regular season again. He's already getting replaced. Not that I think it's a bad thing, just that clearly this guy's not ready to play tier 1. I think he is consistent in terms of the way he plays the game. He's not a nightmare in that front, but certainly not great. And then I think, Xiaohu was obviously great in the mid lane as well. I'm a big fan of Xiaohu. I always have been. Always kind of been a big defender of him on this channel, with really the exception of 2024 spring, where he was a nightmare for Weibo Gaming. But outside of that, he's been excellent throughout his entire career, and he continues to get talked about like he's terrible. I think there aren't a lot of consistent mids in the LPL. Xiaohu is not consistent, but his highs are certainly higher than most other mid laners, and I think that that is good enough for this team. So Weibo looking good, FPX looking bad. We expected this team to not be particularly competitive. I thought they were a bottom 3 team in the entirety of the LPL going into the split, but they've been a little bit better than that. They've been competitive to at the very least, which I think is good. But for me, Jway is going to get dud of the series here. I think people are going to talk about Jway as if he's still in contention for being an all-pro. And while he still is like the bright spot of this team, and I'm not trying to, talk about him as, the long-term prospects are doomed because he's a support playing on this terrible FPX team. Of course, he looks worse in summer than he did in spring when this team had more talent. But at the end of the day, like Jway, his play has fallen off in the back half of this year. And I think a lot of it is him mentally checking out. And I think the team just generally not being there to set up for him. Jway is not an all-pro right now. He's not elevating this team. I think it's impossible for a support to elevate this surrounding core, but it is something worth noting that a lot of people are still talking about Jway as if he's performing like a top 3, support in the league. I just don't really see that in terms of the games that we've gotten, especially in the second half of the split where it really feels like this bot lane has regressed pretty massively. Jhachi, super fed in game number 2 on the Kai'Sa, looked like he could take over, and then had a terrible fight where he insta-ults onto the Rakan in the backline and just dies on the Kai'Sa. If he just plays front to back, I'm pretty sure they just win. Like, genuinely, I think that might have been the difference between winning game number 2 and losing it. Care was actually pretty solid here. Care's been better, I would say, in the second half of this split than he was in the first half. Not by a ton, but certainly, at least he's not getting absolutely steamrolled in the same way. IYY, not going to be around for much longer. Not a whole point talking about him. And Sheer was just outclassed on the top side by Breathe. It's a pretty standard effort here for FPX, but it's a nice win for Weibo, who is trying to keep themselves in that upper echelon. They've really secured that number 5 spot in my power rankings for many weeks, and it really does feel like they might fall there in the standings as well. But then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it's a matchup we're not going to see just once in this video. It's Invictus Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming, and IG is going to pick up the 2-1 series win, but this was not an easy 2-1 series win. That I can promise you. The fact that they won game number 3, absolutely ridiculous. Quite frankly, the fact that they won game number 1 is already ridiculous enough, but this should have been BLG's win. They just throw away game 3, finding the only real way to lose that game in terms of their macro. Like, it shouldn't happen. You shouldn't be making these kinds of mistakes if you're a team as good as Bilibili. Unfortunately for them, they've looked way worse in the second half than they did in the first half. I think a lot of people are pointing to the new jungler buff coming in for Shadow at the beginning of the split that's just not been able to maintain. But as much as I'd like to sit here and say that Shadow was the problem, I really just don't believe he was in this series. I think that there were multiple issues going down for BLG, and we'll talk about it, but we'll get to IG first and foremost. This team didn't really play all that well in this series. I don't want to sit here and hype them up and talk about how they, look so good and they look like a top 2 team. It feels really difficult for me to sit here and be like, they definitely are better than Bilibili, because they should have lost this series. There really is no excuse. And it's the same thing for BLG that we talked about last week, where it's like you come so close and play better for a majority of a series and then end up losing it. They did this against AL as well. But, at some point, you got to start talking about the fact that they can't close any of these games out. And IG were just better when it mattered. Specifically, Gala was absolutely massive when it mattered the most. He was really, really big at the end of game number 1, a 45-minute banger where the Sivir ended up really taking over. And he was massive in game number 3 on the Kai'Sa. Gala Kai'Sa, it's very well documented, but absolutely showed up here today. I think Gala is still much better than everyone gives him credit for. Again, I'm going to get a lot of... I haven't actually gotten a lot of flack for this take. I was expecting to, and so, I think I've always prepared against it, but Gala is Gumayushi. Like, they are the same player. They don't really have a lot of differences. Like, Guma's better, I guess, at, like, securing objectives. Like, that's his whole thing, is he can smite away better than any jungler in the world, but, they're basically the same in team fights. They're basically the same in the early game. Like, I think they're very similar players, having watched a ton of them. I just think one of them is in the LPL where games are more chaotic, and one of them gets to play for T1 where every single game is really easy, all things considered. So, for Gala, I think he's fine. I'm not worried about him. I think this is one of his better performances of the split, and he is getting better, I think, as these games go along. Some other positives, I guess the Shy was really big in game number 3 as well on the Gnar. Was he consistent throughout the series? Absolutely not. His game 2 was bad, like genuinely very bad. So that's something to keep in mind. I don't think Wei was particularly good as a setup man throughout this series. Rookie played one of his weaker series in a while. Knight was definitely better than him on the other side, so much so that I actually considered giving Rookie dud of the series as a whole because of just how poorly he played the first couple games of this series. And Mako's kind of in that same front. Like, the Bard was terrible, the Rel was super aggressive, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. I think the Nico was definitely his best game, but really, it all just came down to the fact that BLG had better setups, they had better early games, and they just couldn't close things out. This series is much more about Bilibili than it is about Invictus, and I think that's the frustrating part, is that this team's macro is just not good enough right now, and that's been kind of a recurring trend for BLG throughout this year, regardless of who has been starting, whether it's been Wei or Beichuan or Shadow. Now in the jungle, it just has never really felt like things are clicking. Shadow Shadow is reportedly taking a very big role in terms of shot calling and being vocal with how this team is operating. If that's the case, then they need to figure out their late games, because Shadow's late game shot calling is clearly not working. As much as I'd like to sit here and give a ton of, flame to Shadow, who I think could have been better throughout this series, I honestly don't think he was the problem. I think his gameplay at the very least was fine on things like Vi and on Sejuani. I just don't think that the rest of the team ended up being there. Bin was a complete non-factor throughout the series, despite having a ton of gold in his pocket on things like M-Pesa, or I guess Rumble, and the Renekton more specifically. The M-Pesa game was generally fine, but the two losses, like, Bin was completely useless, quite frankly, in both of those games, and he needed to be a lot better. The Shy, despite having a worse scoreline, certainly I think involved himself in this series a lot more than Bin was able to do. I think everybody else was fine. Elk certainly could have team fought better, but he was so good at getting gold, especially on that Corki in game 3, that I'm not going to freak out. Knight was just better than Rookie in this series, and I don't think On was the problem by any stretch. It was more so for BLG, just the fact that they couldn't, close the game out. Really, it just comes down to them, once again, getting macro diffed at the end of a series. And if this was isolated, if this was something that wasn't already a problem for them, I wouldn't be worried so much. But this is basically a copy and paste from their series earlier in the split against Anyone's Legend, where they should have won, and then they just didn't. So they just threw everything away in game 3 at the end. BLG, it's all well and good to be able to generate leads if you can't close out games. I'm going to start getting concerned for what this team is going to look like moving forward. But for IG, it's cool to see that this team has a ton of resilience. I think they've looked a lot better than I expected. I thought that inconsistency would start to seep in at some point in terms of how they are playing, but it's not really been the case. They are exactly who they've shown themselves to be, even if that's not necessarily a world beater. Then moving on now to day number 2 of week number 6, and I got to cast this day live for LPL English, and so I am definitely going to be a bit quicker in terms of the overviews for this. Again, check out the links in the description if you want to see the VOD for that live cast, as well as any of the upcoming casts that I'll talk about a bit more at the end of the video. But going over this day at the very least, we started it off with LNG Esports taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and NIP is pretty easily going to pick up the 2-0 victory here. No real concerns or worries or anything like that. This is just one of those series where NIP have way too much going for them in terms of their skill level, and LNG just don't have the answers in a lot of directions. Zeka continues to be solid on the top side of the map for them, but they just don't really have a lot of ways to play the game. They don't have a lot of ways to generate resources, and NIP are certainly good enough to be able to kind of push forward in that regard. Naya is once again going to be getting a player of the series for me, although I did consider Leave for this as well. Should go to one of those two, but Naya has just been so ridiculously valuable for NIP. I think he's on like a Monkey-esque trajectory. I just think he's on a worse team than Monkey. I think there's even an argument that he could be a better player than someone like Monkey going into next year if a top team really wanted to try and pick him up, or if NIP want to try and retool this roster to make themselves a bit more viable. But right now, this is the best team in Group Nirvana, and it's not close, and a lot of that is because they found a perfect strategy to surround a carry jungler with really good pieces. You have a player in Leave who started to take a lot more of a weak side bot lane approach and start to play a lot of these scalers, things like Senna, that really can just make a lot of difference in the late game and not worry too much about, how many resources or how much they have to do in the early game. Doingby is obviously always at his best when he can play these shove and roamers. That is his style. That's what he popularized in terms of the game. And so for him to have a jungler that he can just that can carry games, that can play Lilia and can play a lot of these more resource heavy picks, and even things like Skarner that can really play more aggressive in the early game, it just makes things so much easier for NIP because it plays into all of their different styles. And Nio is obviously very talented. This is a player who won LDL MVP a couple of years ago for a reason. He was just stuck on a terrible Rare Atom team last year that couldn't really get the ball rolling. We saw it earlier on LGD. He can elevate a team now with even better talent around him. He's arguably been the most valuable player to his individual team in the entire league. He's just played a lower level of competition. So credit to Nio, credit to Leave, who was excellent on the Senna. He's really good at these stacking champions. Doingby goes deathless. Solo kill was solid enough on the top side, and the Ket, obviously, as well. NIP just looked good, and for LNG, they just kind of look bad. Like, this team, I will give them credit. Like, they are trying things, and obviously that there are some things you praise about them. They're not passive anymore. Like, something that was really the case with Fodak and Joao in the bot lane, and even really when LP came in, is that this team just kind of did nothing and lost games. Like, they were a team that kind of waited for their opportunity, and it never came, and then they would just lose, and, they would end up bleeding out gold leads that they would generate for themselves in the early game. That's certainly not who they are anymore. The problem is they don't really have the talent, and so these aggressive plays that they do end up going for end up really backfiring, and that's really the problem with OVO, who's getting dud of the series for for me is that, boy, he's constantly looking for engage angles, no matter how good or bad the situation ends up being. This guy just doesn't know when to take his foot off the gas. I think that's fine for the worst team in the league, but certainly a trait that I think could be problematic moving forward. Fish 1 is just terrible. This guy's mechanics are absolutely miserable. He does not look comfortable at all at the tier 1 level. He does not even look close to being a tier 1 player. I think Xiaofang ended up getting really out jungled in this series. Haichao was okay. Certainly the one that was at least being the most aggressive in terms of the plays that he was making. And again, Zika feels kind of trapped on this team in the top lane, but LNG is not good. They're the worst team in the LPL. Even when they try to make plays, oftentimes they do not have the talent to back them up. And NIP are the best team in Group Nirvana, at least for now. With that win over EDG, they really cemented themselves in there. And I would be shocked if this team is not good enough to make playoffs in the state that they're currently in, especially if they do end up finishing first in the group, which is very unlikely, but certainly possible for them at this point. We'll have to see how it ends up working out, but at least for now, NIP looking fantastic. But then moving on to our second series of day 2, and the second series that I cast here in week number 6, and it was a top-of-the-table clash between Anyone's Legend and Top Esports, and TES are going to pick up the 2-0 series win. They're going to be better in basically every aspect of the game in this series, and, you know, I might have been premature putting AL back to number 1 in my power rankings. It really did feel like this team was figuring it out and fixing its problems, but right now, Top Esports is pretty clearly the best team in the LPL, and I think they really asserted that with this dominant victory, as much as LPL fans probably don't want to hear that, considering just how frustrated they get with Top Esports at international events. But you know what? They look fantastic right now. Their off-season move, quote-unquote, of trading Chris for Hong ends up looking like an absolute masterclass from them. They got the better support in that end of the deal, and AL just feel like they don't really have a counterpunch when teams actually play them tough, and I think that that is the real concern. When AL don't get control of the game, what do? They crumble, and that's kind of just what's been happening recently. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Hong is the easy choice for player of the series here for Top Esports. He was a menace on the Rift here today. He was excellent for that Alistar game in Game 1. Absolutely incredible on the Rel in Game 2 as well. And really just took over everything that happened throughout this entire game. Every bit of setup, every bit of creation, it was all on him. And once again, I want to reiterate the point that I've made. I'm not trying to sit here and brag about the take or talk about the fact that I'm like a genius or anything for predicting this, but going into this split, I told everyone Hong is going to turn it around. He's going to be fantastic with Jackie Love, and everything's going to work out because Weibo Gaming just breaks every support that they play with. It's always been the case for them, whether it be on, whether it be Crisp, whether it be Hong, it does not matter. That organization has chewed up and spit out every support that's ever played with them. Every single player has looked better on a different organization, and Hong was the most consistent support in the LPL before this year. You know, I feel pretty good about him coming over to TES. I think he fits their play style very well, and obviously has great engage instincts. I think he's going to be, you know, great for the rest of the year for this team. Jackie Love has obviously felt the positivity of that with him making an MVP push right now, and Hong, I think, very much kind of carried that through. In the same vein, Jackie Love has been excellent. I think you can talk about him just having an unbelievable split, and that's correct, but this shouldn't be all that shocking. I think he's played like this pretty consistently throughout the past couple of years, and I think that is just kind of being highlighted by the fact that TES is actually good right now. Jackie Love is a player I've never given up on. I gave him an MVP award, I want to say, at the end of 2023 when people were kind of out on him. I've always just been a big fan of his gameplay, and I think this bot lane is the best version of the Top Esports bot lane in many years, which is really saying something. I think 369 continues to be solid. Cream had a really good series, was definitely the better of these two mid laners, which I think is relevant considering just how up in the air a lot of the mid lane rankings are right now. Kanavi as a facilitator was very solid. TES was better everywhere across the Rift. Like, there was no debate. They were the best team in this series, and that kind of makes them the de facto best team in the LPL right now. And for AL, you know, again, I was premature putting them back onto the #1 ranking because they just did not play like it. In this series, it wasn't even remotely close. Shanks is the obvious choice for dead of the series, did absolutely nothing on the Galio in Game 1, and then was terrible on the Orianna in Game 2. You know, off the Rift stuff notwithstanding, because again, I don't really want to touch upon that when it comes to Shanks. That's not for this kind of channel to discuss. There have been a lot of people who have gone into it better, and quite frankly, I would just prefer to not talk about it because it's ridiculous, and I can't believe he did that. But outside of that, right, like all of this stuff with Shanks, you have to talk about the fact that this is not weird for him, that this is a player who has consistently gotten worse as the year has gone along. Every year of his career, he always starts off super hot, and then by the end, by August, by September, he's playing the worst league he's played all year long. It's been a consistent thing with Shanks where he's just not been able to maintain his form, and he ends up falling off. I don't know if he gets figured out. I don't know if he just gets burnt out in terms of himself as a player, but every single year of his career, you can track the same exact thing when it comes to Shanks, which is great start, bad finish. And again, like it's happening right now, where Shanks is playing the worst league he's played all year for this team. Now, part of that is the fact that Tarzan is and will continue to be AL. There are 3 members of this team that were 6th, 7th place, not really competing to be top of the standings, and then they added Tarzan and Flandra, of course, but really they added Tarzan and all of a sudden they're winning the league. He is the difference maker, and if he's not carrying games, they're not going to be competitive at the top of the standings. But you need everyone else to step up in that same vein. Hope and Kyle were outclassed in this one, and I don't even think that's all that controversial. Kyle was certainly worse than Hong. Hope was nightmarish in this series. I think that Callista ended up looking terrible in game 2. Flandra, the only one who wasn't actively running it, and even then, it's not like he was winning against 369. Like, AL did not look like they could compete with TES, and TES right now look like the best team in the league. That is very, very good for top esports fans, and I know that there are going to be a large section of LPL fans that are upset by that phrase. Then moving on now to day number 3 of week number 6, and this was a really important one in Group Nirvana to kick off the day. It was Thunder Talk Gaming taking on LGD Gaming, and LGD is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. They have already cemented themselves in the upper echelon of Group Nirvana teams, not quite at the level of Ninjas and Pyjamas and Edward Gaming, of course, but certainly better than basically everybody else fighting it out in the group. They're that number 3 seed, if you will, in Group Nirvana, but Thunder Talk is fighting for their lives right now. Ultra Prime has kind of taken a bit of a lead in terms of getting that number 4 seed and being able to get into the play-ins, and Thunder Talk really needed this kind of victory to kind of get themselves back into that conversation. They just don't have the talent to be able to do so. There are good players on this team, but even the good players are starting to play quite bad. I think morale is probably quite low on this team, all things considered, and it's really hurting them, but we'll talk about it from LGD's perspective because I think they played great in this series. Almost nothing to criticize outside of, once again, just Xiao Qinghua just not being a player that I believe in all that much on things like Galio and Talia. All due respect to him. I'm sure he's a fine enough person. I just don't really believe in the skill set that I've seen at the LPL level. Everyone else at this on this LGD team at least looked very good in this series in particular, but I'm giving YCX the player of the series, the Rel. Very good in game number 1. Really ended up being the primary form of engage despite the fact that you had Climber on Wukong. Climber was fine, by the way. I think that there were things he could have done a bit better. There are still a lot of improvements in his game that he needs to make, but YCX was there to kind of step up and really be the primary form of engage throughout a lot of this series. It really came to a head, though, on the Nico in game 2, where he hit multiple, 3, 4-man Pop Blossom engages, and at that point, it's really easy for LGD to be able to clean up because they were already pretty strong from the early game. I think YCX is an interesting support player. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm as high on him as maybe some other analysts are. I've seen some people talking about him as if he's like what Jue was last year, or Niket even was, and I don't think he's that kind of prospect. I think, even with hindsight, I was really high on those 2 other guys, and I'm certainly not nearly as high on YCX. Maybe he ends up surprising me and joins that conversation for a player that could theoretically break his way into the upper part of like a Group Ascend type of team, but right now I'm more so just expecting him to be solid enough at this level, which I think is fine. There aren't a lot of, consistently great supports. I think Savior was pretty good here, was definitely better than 1xN despite what Reddit would like to make you believe. Again, 1xN just has this absolute army of believers that I guess I'm just not a part of. I think he's a very good player, and I think this is his best split ever, but man, I just do not see this guy being like a top 580 carry in the league. Maybe I'm wrong. I just don't think he has the skill set to do so. We'll get to it on the other side, but Xavier was better than him in this series, even if he did have better setup. Sasa was excellent in this series. I very much debated giving him player of the series, especially because of that Rumble game in game number 1. He massacred Hoya, but quite frankly, everybody massacres Hoya, so it's starting to become a bit less impressive in terms of just how the split is breaking down. That being said, still happy for Sasa to really be able to, I guess, really drive the point home. Like, he is a very interesting up-and-coming top laner. If there is a player to watch on this roster that I think actually could be a really good piece in the LPL in the future, I think Sasa is actually the player that you should be, looking at. Xiao Qinghua was fine. Climber was good, but overall, he was playing a jungler who was playing pretty bad, so hard to really take too much away from that. LGD is a good team. They're just not a great team. They're fine enough for Group Nirvana, but they're kind of underdogs, in my opinion, to make the playoffs. And then for Thunder Talk on the other side, this team is just bad. I think they're really starting to seal their own fate right now in the bottom 2 with losses like this, because you can't really be losing this, and you especially cannot be losing it 2-0. So this is a really bad spot for them. Aki, for me, is going to get done of the series, although it really is up for debate. I think Hoya was just unplayable on the top side. The problem with Hoya at this point is I'm honestly expecting him to be this bad, and so it comes across a little bit less terrible when when he just goes out there and goes 0-9-3 and gets, blown back on Ornn and on Mbessa. Like, it's no longer a surprise to see Hoya be the worst player on the Rift. For Aki, I think he is making some okay plays, but the bad plays are just so game-losingly terrible that it's just really difficult for me to look at him in any sort of positive light. And I think that's really what it's come down to. I'm giving up on Aki. I've been a bit of an Aki defender because he was so good for OMG in 2023, but 2024, 2025, it's just not been there. I didn't really believe in him before that year anyways. I was pretty vocal in 2022 about how I thought Aki was overrated. So, it's one of those things where 1 year wonder just kind of was the right circumstance, right place, right time for him to be a good enabler. He's just not that in the LPL anymore. I don't really see a huge future for him at this point. Saytab was fine, probably the best player on the team in the series, ironically enough, because he got his Akali in game number 2. Feather was okay. I'm not really blaming him. 1XM, again, like, I want to make it clear, his mechanics are very good, and in a different situation, could I see him growing and evolving? Yes, but I don't really see him as all that different from a player like Assume, who has gotten replaced on multiple different organizations, who's not really ever been viewed as a long-term AD carry, where the mechanical ceiling is just not there for me. He's a jack of all trades, master of none type of AD carry, and that's a bit of a limiter in my opinion. And I hear a lot of people talking about him as if it's like, oh, get him onto a good organization and get him with a good surrounding core, get him some good development, and he's just going to become a top tier AD carry. I'm just not sure that skill set is there for him as an ADC. I think he kind of is a high floor, low ceiling type of AD carry. I think that's always been a bit of what 1xN offers. He's a good player, but look at the positioning in this series. It was quite terrible, and it's always been a bit of a question for him. So I'm not on this 1xN train where he's going to be an absolute superstar. I think he is a good AD carry at this level, someone that a team like FPX or, a bottom tier Group Ascend team would like to have. I'm certainly not saying he's Group Nirvana worthy, but I'm not trying to sit here and say that this is a guy I expect to go to Worlds next year, depending on the team that he gets picked up by, right? Like, it's just one of those things where, I think Thunder Talk is too bad for him. I think a team like, Weibo Gaming would be too good for him. I see a lot of people talking about, oh, Weibo picking up 1xN. I don't think he's all that different from Light, even with Light playing all that bad. Light's a better player, certainly has a better track record. So Thunder Talk in a pretty bad spot, and LGD at least kind of confirming who they are, the third best team in Group Nirvana. Not the best place for them to be, but once again, kind of the role they've occupied for many years now. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it was a pretty clear-cut matchup between Anyone's Legend and FunPlus Phoenix, where Anyone's Legend is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. No real surprises here. It's good to see AL get back on the board after a pretty terrible loss to Top Esports, but FPX is just one of those teams that's there in Group Ascend to get rolled over. This team was a disaster throughout a majority of the spring split. Even when it came to their gameplay, they ended up sneaking their way into the playoffs despite expectations, and yet they have not been able to do anything other than get worse throughout the rest of the year. It just kind of is what it is when it comes to FPX at this point. But for AL, very easy to talk about them. If Tarzan plays well, it's great. If Tarzan doesn't play well, it looks terrible. Tarzan was excellent in this series, and he's player of the series, and therefore AL ends up winning. Tarzan versus IYY is clearly a bit of a mismatch in terms of how the jungle ended up breaking down. Not exactly the worst part of the map for FPX, but certainly one of the bad parts of the map. And again, I can't simplify it enough other than to say Tarzan is the difference between AL being 4th and AL being 1st. If he's going to play like a monster, if he's going to be able to take over games and really push things forward, this team is going to compete to win the entire league. If he can't do that, if he is going to get out jungled, if he's going to be disconnected, especially vocally from the rest of the team, then things are going to get bad for AL very quickly. Luckily for them, it looked good in this series, but I'm not trying to sit here and say that AL is a one-player team, but he certainly means more to AL than any other player means to any other top team right now in the LPL. Their entire seasonal performance basically is dictated by whether or not Tarzan shows up or not. So hopefully for AL fans, Tarzan is going to be the player that can show up and still get this team to Worlds and still can make a big impact and even try to win the LPL. Outside of that, the rest of the team was good here. I think Shanks was much better than he was earlier this week. That is necessary for them, but he's going into care. Don't want to freak out about that too much. Hope and Kyle were certainly better. Kyle was definitely better than Jway, and we'll talk about it. Jway just looks so mentally checked out at this point. It's honestly ridiculous. Fondra was solid on the top side, better than Sheer, even though Sheer was very active. AL is better across the board. Not really a ton to say in that regard. For FPX on the other side, really, dud of the series came down to IYY or Jway. It should go to one of those two players. I'm giving it to Jway in the support position because I think his mistakes are much more obvious, like in terms of the way they're being made. IYY is just outclassed. Like the talent isn't there, even if he is trying to make okay plays at this level. Like Jway is just not trying anymore. He's so mentally checked out. It does not feel like this guy is even attempting to play anymore. This team can very much still make the playoffs, which I think a lot of people forget about. But Jway, if he is mentally checked out, if him and Jachi aren't going to work together, this guy was already being talked about being frustrated with the organization in terms of some of the changes and wanting to leave in the offseason. If he's not going to be putting in 100% of the effort, it's just not going to work out. There's not a lot else you can say. So those engages looking quite bad from Jway, and he's going to land out of the series because of it. Again, IYY was also mega out-jungled by Tarzan, but I want to reiterate that most of the mistakes that he ended up making were not because he was making terrible plays or in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rather, he's just not good enough to be a tier 1 jungler, especially going up against some of the best junglers in the world like Tarzan. I think Kare looked completely outclassed. He did not look even remotely competent. You know, I talked about him getting better over the second half of the split. That doesn't mean he's good. It means he's still getting gapped by the actual good mid laners, and that still is the case. Jachi still has good KDAs, not necessarily there in terms of his gameplay, and Sheer is Sheer on the top side. FPX is the worst team in Group Ascend. Their backs are up against them in terms of even making the playoffs at this point coming out of Group Ascend. I think they would lose to most teams coming out of Group Nirvana. Maybe not all, because, you know, perhaps they would beat a team like Ultra Prime, but that might be the only one right now with the form that they are in. And for anyone's Legend on the other side, it's a nice win for them, but once again, it all comes down to whether or not Tarzan can step up. There is a difference between getting blown out by Top Esports and beating up on FPX. One of those matters a lot more, and unfortunately, the win here isn't the one that I'm the most concerned about. So for AL, hopefully you can, you know, continue to build on this and end the season strong. And moving on now to day number 4, our middle day of week 6 at the very least. Very much not our middle day of the video, but kicking off day 4 was a matchup between Ultra Prime and LGD Gaming, where EDG obviously are better. They end up steamrolling Ultra Prime. There is very little to talk about in terms of how this series ended up going. Ultra Prime wanted to be able to at least pick up a game win here because they wanted to try and make it interesting moving forward, whether or not, you know, they locked up that number 4 spot, or I guess make it less interesting in terms of locking up that number 4 spot. But it's LGD Gaming. It's arguably the best team in Group Nirvana, who has stumbled a bit, let's be honest, down the stretch of this split. They've not been able to maintain their undefeated type of form, but they still are fantastic, and this team still is, on paper, way too good to be in Group Nirvana, and they are kind of proving it. Xiaohao was the obvious choice for player of the series. He went deathless, is the word I'm looking for in this series, on Jarvan and on Xin Zhao. The fact that you can play, you know, as strong as he did and as aggressive as he did throughout this series and create as much as you did for the team and not die at all is just a jungle masterclass. You don't need me to tell you what my thoughts on Xiaohao are. If you've been watching the channel at all, this guy is like the channel darling of the LPL. I think that there are other players that have hyped up more. You know, Tarzan's a better player, and, you know, Tarzan is definitely a bit of a channel darling that's ended up coming true, but Xiaohao is, like, from the beginning, the guy that continuously, still to this day, is not getting his flowers, that I think still is very good. There have been channel darlings that have, for the most part, either been, you know, channel darlings before they broke out, and then they broke out. Players like Tarzan, players like Kyle, players like Zeka back in 2022. That I was calling kind of on these big breakout arcs, or there have been players that were channel darlings that I've just kind of given up on, like Dudu over in the LCK. But Xiaohao's the one player that I'm still kind of pounding the table for, that everyone seems to not believe in. I hope at some point this guy gets like a real opportunity on a top team. Not that stint on Weibo that he got last year. I think that was a pretty unfair way to categorize what Xiaohao is as a player. This guy is still an absolute menace, and I want to see what he can do if he's actually given the opportunity to play with really good players around him, because he's never really had that opportunity. And the reason I want to see that is because the rest of this EDG team, while they're not great from an LPL standpoint, are definitely really good from a Group Nirvana standpoint, and they're just kind of able to outclass everyone they're going up against mechanically. Palkia is awesome. I really like this guy. I think he is like the support to watch in Group Nirvana out of every team that includes Ninjas and Pyjamas. I really do think that Palkia could be like an EDG mainstay if they want to keep him around, but you know, we'll see. I mean, they had Vampire last year and they let him go, although I think Palkia is a much better player, at least from day number 1, than Vampire was. So we'll see how that, you know, moves forward. On, I think, is, you know, inconsistent, but he's going to play to the level of the team. If the team is winning, he's going to be fine. ZDZ has been much better than he's ever really been before this split, but again, he's going up against such inconsistent talent that I don't want to give him too much credit right now. I'm still not a huge believer in ZDZ, but at the very least, he's not running it down like he has been before. An Angel's been solid, like your stereotypical, you know, don't put too many resources into me, I'm going to play a backseat role type of mid laner. So, you know, EDG are exactly who we thought they were and who they have been, and for Ultra Prime, this is kind of the result you you expected. This is not a team that I think is particularly good. They're just better than the terrible teams here in Group Nirvana, which isn't saying all that much. Junhao for me is going to get dud of the series. You know, Junhao is more like the winter version of himself than he is like the spring version of himself right now. I think the meta has kind of moved away from the things he was really good at, which were, you know, carry junglers. I think Neferi meta was very good for Junhao, and I don't think it's been, you know, quite as good so far this split when he has to play Trundle and Wukong and be a primary engager and try to establish tempo in the mid game and do a lot more setup and prep and, you know, yada, 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 all this stuff. I don't think it's really fit him nearly as well. Now, Xiaohao has taken advantage of basically every jungler at this level, so, you know, who cares? Like, it's Junhao losing once again, but I think it's worth noting that at least over the course of this split, a lot of the excitement that he started to generate about himself from the spring split, I don't think all of that is quite there anymore, at least for me. Zhang was also terrible on the top side. If you want to give him dead of the series, I'm certainly not going to argue against that. In fact, I would argue he was worse in game number 1 on the Mbessa, maybe a little bit better on the Sion in game 2, but it's Sion. Like, how badly can you screw that up? Baya and Xiaoxia are still a bot lane, I don't believe, and I still don't think Xiaoxia is a good player at all in the support position, and support is the position that generally I've gotten the most correct on this channel throughout this, you know, the time being up, I guess you could say. Baya is also just kind of fine. I think that there is something potentially to build on there from a mechanical standpoint, but mostly it's just kind of hope and optimism. Saber's okay. He's started to get a little bit better at playing these mage type of champions, even though he is more of an assassin player, but Ultra Prime are just hoping and praying that the bottom teams end up flaming out. Thundertalk already lost this week. That's pretty good. For Ultra Prime, we'll see how that continues to go. And for Edward Gaming on the other side, really nice win here. If they win out, if they continue to, you know, beat up on the teams they're supposed to beat up on, they will be the #1 seed coming out of Group Nirvana, which is ideal with the way that FPX is looking right now. So hopefully EDG can keep the form up. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and it was a matchup between JD Gaming and Bilibili Gaming, where BLG are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. This is a weird one to discuss because while I do think BLG ended up playing well, so much of what happened this series can be kind of summarized with Scout's Aurora game in game number 3, where he just completely ran it down, where he was the worst player on the Rift and it was not particularly close. It's really tough to kind of pinpoint an exact problem for JDG outside of the fact that Scout just would not allow the team to play the game. And credit to BLG, they took advantage of the fact that Scout was so bad here in game number 3, but JDG just feel like a nightmare in terms of where they are at right now. I think that there are good players on this team. I think Xiaoshu ended up looking very good in this series. Pays, I think, is starting to, at the very least, showcase some of the things he was, you know, for the entirety of the beginning of the year and just hasn't been so far in summer with Zhuo back in over Wink. But really, at the end of the day, like, if this mid lane's going to be this bad and if jungle is going to start underperforming like Shun has over the course of the past couple series, things are going to get really tough for this team to even try and compete to be top 5, let alone to try to go to Worlds like they wanted to. But for BLG, pretty nice win. You know, definitely a nice bounce back over earlier this week because they really did not need to lose to Invictus, but they ended up looking much better in this series. Still kind of got slammed in game 2. In fact, game 2 is probably the most concerning game of the series because it was just kind of everyone winning. Xiaoshu looking great on the Jax in the top lane. Scout looking great on the Gallia, which people are going to forget about because of that game number 3, both rightfully and wrongfully so, but certainly something that people won't remember. But BLG definitely, you know, put in some work in this series. Knight is incredible on Ziggs. It's truly turning into a pick that I think you might have to, like, consistently ban against BLG because he's been so good at it throughout basically all of this year. Knight is player of the series for me. That gap in game number 3 was monumentally large. Like, Knight is the best mid laner in the LPL, and it's not close. He has been for a long time, and anybody knows, like, I think he's on pace to be the best LPL player ever. You know, I think he's already in that conversation if you really do want to put him there, but especially right now with how weak the mid lane position is and how inconsistent it's been for basically everybody in the league, for Knight to still be so good and to be the clear-cut #1 guy, the only mid laner you can actually trust at the LPL level, it's pretty cool, all things considered. So I'm glad to see Knight continuing to play well. The rest of this team, you know, ups and downs, we'll just say. Bin was solid. I think even with Xiaoshu playing well, there's not really a lot to complain about when it came to Bin's performance. He took more of a step back in this series with the resources, and I think that that really helped him in comparison to earlier this week against the Shy. I think Elk and On were fine. Certainly not, like, unbelievable. I continue to be a bit lower on Elk this year in terms of his performance, just because I don't think that killer instinct is quite as much there as it's been in the past. This guy last year was willing to, you know, trade his life 2v2 and really get the game snowballing out of control. I just don't think that version of Elk is here in 2025. Perhaps that controlled chaos ends up being better for them down the line, but what we saw at Worlds when he was, like, actively pushing this team forward, you know, getting them over the hump that was Hanwha Life in the quarterfinals, and then, you know, obviously getting them to World Finals as well, being a big big piece on the team for that was his aggressive tendencies, was the fact that he was willing to play so aggro early on in the game and be so lane dominant. He's just not had that kind of play style across this year, and I think that has, that's been a reason why BLG has not found the same level of consistency. I'll just say that. On also just inconsistent as well, but for the most part, way better than people give him credit for this year. Shadow continues to be a bit of a question mark in terms of some of the engages, but generally the setup here was fine. BLG was fine. Like, they're okay. Knight was really good, and everybody else on the team was generally fine. I'm not overwhelmingly positive about BLG right now, but it was good enough. But really the story around this series is that Scout might just genuinely be cooked. Like, there really isn't a lot else I can say. This game 3 from him on Aurora is completely unacceptable. He got massacred in the mid lane by Knight, like genuinely made to look like they are not even on the same plane of existence. And that's after a good game number 2 on the Galio. And that's the frustrating part, right? Is that the flashes for Scout are still there, but the overall package has been the worst it's ever been in his entire career. We are 2 years removed from back-to-back MVP Scout on LNG. Do people just forget about that era? Like, that was not that long ago when it came to him. It's not like he was bad ever since he won Worlds on EDG. It's really just a 2025 problem for him. And honestly, I don't really know what to say. Like, this guy was at Worlds last year in the Swiss stage performing like one of the best players at the entire tournament. And then obviously, things don't work out in the quarterfinals. But whatever's going wrong with Scout, it's going to delay JDG's upside if he is not even good. Because right now he's not good. Like, he's actively detrimental. He's really holding the team back. If he's not going to be good, this team is not going to go anywhere. It's as simple as that. And that's with the rest of this team starting to figure things out. Against, contrary to popular belief, Zhuo's actually made this team better. I think Wink was a miserable fit with Paige, and whatever happened in the bot lane between those two was just not going to work out. Zhuo, the worst player between him and Wink, I want to make that clear, has come in and, Paze has played much better ever since Zhuo has come in. So hopefully this bot lane duo ends up being a bit more stable. I think Shun and Xiaoshu were fine. Xiaoshu in particular was really good in this series on the top side and just generally didn't have the combat power to be able to take over in the same kind of way. But if the middle of the map is going to be this much of a nightmare, there's nowhere to play for JDG, and they will continue to stay outside of the upper echelon. This team is not close to even being number 5. They're closer to being WE and FPX than they are to being Weibo Gaming and even Bilibili Gaming. So not a great place to be in for JDG, but it's an important win for BLG to continue their momentum. They're a top 4 team. It's just, how much do you really want to trust them right now? I think that there are a lot of question marks about what BLG actually is, and I think there's a real shot this team maybe isn't as good as they want to be right now. Then moving on now to day number 5 of week number 6, and kicking off day 5 was a matchup between Invictus Gaming and FunPlus Phoenix, where IG is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. They're going to look very good in this series, and honestly, I've kind of been waiting for that shoe to drop when it comes to IG, and it's just not dropping. This team is just in a really good spot right now. I think a lot of their players are playing the best they've played all year long. Rookie, I think, is in great form. Gala, I think, is in great form. The Shy is in great form right now on the top side, and everything is just clicking. Again, it's against FPX, so I don't want to freak out too much, but FPX's only win this split in terms of a series is over IG, a series that I casted with a ridiculous finish. So this definitely feels a bit like revenge for IG. Not much left to say about FPX that I haven't already said in this video. Their segment might be shorter than even the other ones that we've gotten already, but let's go ahead and get into it. The Shy for me is going to get player of the series. Let's talk about the Shy for a bit, because I do have a bit of a reputation for being, not as high on the Shy. I've had some people say that I'm like the number 1 the Shy hater. No way. Like, there's just no shot that there is nobody out there that hates him more than I do, because I don't really hate the Shy. I just kind of, I dislike what he is for the game in terms of, when he shows up and when he doesn't. He's always been a player that's kind of coasted through the regular season, not really given a shit, not tried all that much, and then it gets to playoffs, it gets to Worlds, and then he starts to lock in. And even when he does start to lock in, he can still be relatively inconsistent, but the best games are still some of the best games any top laner has ever played, and that mechanical upside is why, everybody really loves him as a player. He developed that reputation in 2018, for a reason. It's because the good games are just so fun to watch, and he's such a flashy player that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I'm willing to say, like, very happily that that's not really been the case so far this regular season. This is probably the best regular season he's ever had, especially since, like, 2019. I think that era, the Shy was still trying. He was still new to the league, and he hadn't really, I guess, gained the reputation of being such a beloved figure, so he couldn't get away with being so lackadaisical in most of his games quite yet. Like, that era of him was still very good, but now he's, like, actually putting in a ton of work here for IG. He's been great throughout this regular season. Easily one of the best top laners in the entire league right now, which I think is really fun. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep it up and carry that into playoffs, but he's been great all split long, and he was really important in this series in particular. Look at the Rumble game. Look at the Scion game. He was super consistent throughout all of this, so give him a lot of praise for that. Rookie has been in really good form as well. I don't think his laning is all that good, and I think that's something that is inherently going to hold him back, but in a sea of mid laners who don't really know what they're doing at the later part of the game, having a player like Rookie who is just such a good team fighter, who is so consistent at being able to set things up for everybody else, is so valuable in this league. I honestly think him and Xiaohu are in pretty similar spots where they're kind of secretly the main characters of their team, where they're not generating a ton of resources in the early game. They're not necessarily played for in the same kind of way, but they always end up making some sort of play in the back half, both for good and for bad, that really changes their team's outcome. I thought Wei was really good in this series, but again, IYY is just not a tier 1 caliber jungler, specifically definitely not a group ascend caliber jungler. Gala and Mako continuing to look very positive. I think this is the best this bot lane has looked all year long. IG are just kind of clicking right now. This is the best version of this team so far in 2025, and it's a pretty great time for that to happen. The only concern that you would have if you're an IG fan is that typically when they look good going into playoffs, that's when they underperform the most. So hopefully they don't do that, but for FPX, like, what do I even say at this point that I haven't already said this week? Everything I've already talked about is the case. Again, it's the exact same in this series. IYY is done of the series for me. He's not necessarily good enough talent-wise to be able to keep up with IG. Again, I don't think he makes terrible mistakes. I don't think he's like, horrible macro-wise. He just doesn't really have the mechanics to actually, participate at the tier 1 level, which it just is what it is. Care got completely outplayed here by Rookie, especially once we got later and later into the team fight stage. Care is not Knight when it comes to Ziggs. That is for sure. Sheer got absolutely blasted by the Shy on the top side of the map. Jiachi and Jui continue to underperform. There's just not really a lot to talk about. This is the worst team in Group Ascend, and right now their backs are up against the wall to even make the playoffs at all. But for IG, this is a really nice win. I've had them at number 4 in my power rankings because of some unfortunate losses. This might just be a top 2 team in the LPL. Hell, they can win the LPL, and I wouldn't really be all that surprised in terms of the kind of upside that this team has. And I think any IG fan going into the year would have loved to hear that they are likely a Worlds team at this point, and, a team that really can make a big difference. If that is the ceiling of this team, regardless of whether they win the league or not, I think that's going to be considered a success. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5, and it was a pretty big upset, quite frankly, here as we saw LGD Gaming taking on Edward Gaming, with LGD picking up a 2-0, and this is not some inconsequential upset win for LGD. This really matters for EDG, a team that really couldn't afford to lose a series like this if they still wanted to get that number 1 seed, despite their loss to Ninjas in Pyjamas. This was likely the most important series that they had left to play, because if they had won out, if they had gone, undefeated the rest of the split, they would have had the game record over NIP to still be able to get that number 1 spot and to face FPX going into the play-in tournament. That might not be the case anymore. This is a really consequential loss and a horrible time for them to play arguably their worst series of the entire split. But this is a really big win for LGD just in terms of a confidence booster. Things are not perfect at the bottom of Group Ascend, and I'm not trying to sit here and say that LGD, if they're matched up into a team like JD Gaming, are going to be favorites or anything like that, but it's certainly not impossible to imagine a world where they end up performing better than people are expecting in a matchup like that. And let's talk about why. I think the big shock here is just how well the solo laners ended up playing. I love Sasa. I continue to believe that he's a very good player on the top side of the map, but Xiao Chenghua in the mid lane was excellent in this series, and that is a real shock to me. Not because, Angel's like this unbelievable, unbeatable player. I think Angel has not really been able to recapture that 2023 summer form that he had on Ninjas in Pyjamas even last year on OMG, but I think Xiaoqing was a player that I've given up on almost entirely. I just haven't really seen the upside, and he was super consistent in this series. He had a double-digit kill Silas game in game number 1, a champion he's always been good at, okay, but then he played a really good Galio game in game number 2 as well to be able to enable this Ambessa to really take over. It was a solo lane diff in favor of LGD, but I think Xiaoqing was the most relevant of those 2 solo laners, and for that to be the case, if he is going to start building on something and getting better throughout the year, that's really cool, because again, I've kind of been calling him one of the worst players in the LPL, so cool to see him at least have that kind of upside here. Again, Sasa was excellent, but specifically on this Ambessa in game number 2, I think if he had been a bit more aggressive on the Rumble in game number 1, if he had participated a bit more in why the team ended up steamrolling that first game, then he probably would have gotten player of the series, because he was better in the second and deciding game. And I love me some Sasa. Not surprising to see him be better than ZDZ. I think there is a real argument that he is just better than ZDZ in terms of a top laner right now. Climber was really solid. Xiao Hao had an uncharacteristically lax series. Not that he doesn't have bad series, but typically speaking, when he plays bad, it's because he's overly aggressive and sometimes gets himself into bad positions. He was just a lot more passive than normal in this series, which was a bit frustrating, but Climber very much took advantage of that. Savior and YCX were very good. Definitely the better bot lane here. A great week so far for the bot lane of LGD, which I think is exciting. Honestly, not really a lot to feel frustrated by if you're an LGD fan. This was a stomp, and they were better basically everywhere across the map. This is a massive result for them, and hopefully they're going to be able to keep this momentum up. And for EDG on the other side, you know, this was just one of those series that you have to just go, well, I hope this isn't who they actually are. I hope that, you know, they still are the awesome team that we saw at the beginning of the split, because what they showed here was quite horrendous, to be frank. Palkia is going to get done of the series. You know, we said it for OVO earlier on in the week, and I'm not comparing Palkia to OVO, but two newer players, two rookies in the LPL here. When you are this aggressive style support and games are not necessarily going exactly as planned, sometimes that can really pull you off your game plan, and you can sometimes struggle to know when to take your foot off the gas. I think Palkia has already shown that that is a bit of a problem for him at this level, that there are going to be games where he just continues to try and do too much, and that was the case in both Game 1 and Game 2. I think he definitely got outplayed by YCX in terms of how that happened, and honestly, I am very surprised by that outcome. On didn't really help things. Again, On is more of a benefactor, I think, of what the rest of the team is doing. He's not been able to create anything on his own. He's not really elevating the team. If the team is playing well, he's doing well, and if the team is not playing well, he's running it down, and I think we saw that in game number 1. Xiao Hao was super inactive. As I said, ZDZ got mega gapped by Sasa on the top side in terms of the aggressiveness. When you pick two tanks and don't really get to do anything, that's not all that ideal, and Angel was certainly worse than Xiao Qinghua, which is really, again, not all that acceptable for EDG. This is a consequential loss. This could be the loss that ends up keeping them out of that number 1 spot. And I'm not saying that WE is like unbeatable, but you'd certainly much rather play FPX than WE right now. And so that number 1 spot's actually a really consequential thing for EDG to get. But LGD really standing in the way of that. This team continues to have, you know, big upsets towards the end of a split and continue to overperform in terms of what their record actually is. This has to be like the 3rd year in a row where they get into, you know, a really nice winning streak at the end of the year. Hopefully this time they're able to keep it up in the same kind of way they've been able to previously. But then moving on now to day number 6, our super day here in week number 6, at the very least at the start of this video, I say 50 minutes in, but kicking off day number 6 was a matchup between LNG Esports and Thunder Talk Gaming, and these are likely the two teams that are not going to make play-ins going toe-to-toe, so this is genuinely just for, you know, pride at this point, and especially because LNG actually does pick up the 2-0 win. This basically eliminates Thunder Talk. I think it actually practically eliminates Thunder Talk. I can't quite remember either way. Like, these are the bottom two teams in the LPL, and they are the two teams that will be getting eliminated before the play-in stage. Luckily for LNG, they've kind of proven that at the very least some of their changes have made them a bit more competent. Fish One, while he's not very good, is certainly at least comparable to LP and Photic in terms of the gameplay that he's showing, and he's not quite as much of a resource-heavy player as those two. And then OVO has genuinely just been an upgrade over Zhuo, who, ironically enough, has been an upgrade himself over Wink on JDG, but it's just very funny how things have worked out. LNG is certainly playing better now than they have at most other points this year, and Thunder Talk are playing at their absolute worst. There is nothing else left to say about Thunder Talk as a team. This team is disastrous in multiple different areas. Their solo laners are the worst in the entire league. Satab has very much taken over the role as the worst mid laner in the LPL, and everybody's talking about 1xN being stuck. I agree, he's the best player on this team, but he's not salvaging anything on this roster. It is just a nightmare right now for Thunder Talk, so we'll get into it. Haichao, for me, is going to get player of the series. I think this is what really kind of solidifies Satab as the worst mid laner in the league, because, you know, it was kind of a three-way race. It was Haichao, it was Xiao Qinghua, and it was Satab, and all of them were playing quite bad, and none of them really had a lot going for them, but now you have Haichao coming out and absolutely massacring Satab in game number 1 and game number 2 in this series, and yeah, it's just cooked. Like, there's nothing else left to say. Haichao, if you're going to, like, absolutely obliterate someone like Satab, then Satab must be unplayable at the LPL level. We already kind of knew that, especially in terms of some of the individual results we got, but this really confirms it. Haichao is not a player that I'm fully back on board to believing in at this point. Obviously, he was incredible last year, but that does feel more like a one-year wonder kind of thing at this point. 2024, definitely a bit more of an outlier. He wasn't very good before that. He's not been good this year at all. And so who knows? Maybe Haichao's getting back on the board. Maybe he's starting to feel a bit more comfortable. You know, he pulled out Ari and Orianna, much more standard mid laners in this one. Maybe he just didn't really like playing assassins. I don't really know what the case is. Either way, it's cool to see him at the very least have a good series here. Zika was arguably better in game number 2 on the Cassante. He was the one that really took over in terms of the damage and just being able to dominate every fight. But again, I hate giving this caveat. It's just really hard to be like, oh, Zika dominated Hoya. That means Zika was incredible. Like, Haichao Xiao was excellent in this series, and I think he was a bit more valuable than Zika, but, you know, he also had to play against Satab, and Zika got to play against Hoya, who's just unplayable at this level as well. The solo laners for ThunderTalk, both of the imports are just not accessible. Like, it's terrible. There's nothing to say for ThunderTalk, and Zika took advantage of that. Xiaofeng was good. Aki was a nightmare in game number 1 on the Trundle in particular, and that's really not acceptable. Xiaofeng ended up really taking advantage of that. Fish1 and OVO played their best series as a duo. Fish1 certainly had his best series as a member of LNG, at least as a tier 1 player here. And, you know, going against 1xN and Feather, that's not a great time for that to happen. I'm not blaming 1xN entirely for this, but I do think there is something to be said about the fact that Fish1 was generating an advantage on him in the bot lane. It's not like this was just one of those situations where the entire team lost and 1xN didn't get to play. Part of that was the case, especially on the Smolder in game 2, but you can't really allow a player like Fish1 to generate a lead at all in a series like this. OVO's aggressive tendencies really work when the team gets to play from ahead. Everything really worked for LNG, and everything did not work for ThunderTalk. There's almost not a ton to talk about here. The worst jungle mid I've seen in the LPL in a very long time with Aki and Satab. They have negative chemistry together. Aki has had such a miserable 2025 one that I think might keep him out of the LPL maybe forever in terms of the actual outcome. It genuinely was that detrimental to his legacy. Satab comes over from DRX. He looks okay at the start of the year when ThunderTalk is overperforming. There are moments and individual games you can point to where he feels like he's actually kind of figuring things out, but over the course of this year, it's been proven that the bad games are much more common than the good ones for him, and he's easily done of the series here. 1-12-4, most of that coming in game 1 on the Taliyah, but some of that still in game 2 here on the Annie. Just not a great performance, like genuinely absolutely miserable. This guy is not an LPL caliber player. Hoya is not an LPL caliber player. Again, when you're spending 2 import slots on 2 Koreans on your solo lanes, and both of them are arguably the worst players in their role in the entire league, like, your management has done something absolutely catastrophically wrong. You have to remember, I put ThunderTalk as a bottom 2, bottom 3 team going into the year. On paper, I looked like an idiot for that in terms of how this team played at the beginning of the year, but this is the real talent level of ThunderTalk. I think it just took them a while to catch back up to who they actually are. 1xN is interesting. I'm not going to go on the rant again. I do think he's a Group Ascend player. Like, I want to make that clear. There are multiple 80 carries in Group Ascend that I think 1xN could be better than, but do I think this guy's a world beater? No. I think you could put him on a really good team and he would just be an average kind of player. I think he's a slightly worse version of Hope. Like, I think that really is just what I see with 1xN. I hope he proves me wrong. Feather was terrible here. Like, ThunderTalk are just a disaster, and this really seals the deal. This is likely the worst team left in the LPL after OMG and RNG were, you know, kicked out, and if LNG are going to be taking advantage of them like this, like, I don't even think that's all that up for debate. But it's a cool win for LNG. It doesn't really mean anything. This team's already been eliminated, but it helps kind of seal the fate of a team in ThunderTalk on the other side. And at the very least, you're showing some confidence going into the end of the year. I don't really know what 2026 looks like for this organization, who did try to win this year and just failed absolutely miserably. Maybe they do get their, you know, bearings back about them and build around some other pieces and become contenders again next year. But at the very least, for now, what they're proving is that they're getting better over the course of this year, which is a good thing. But then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and a pretty obvious outcome that enhances a narrative even more, I'll just say. It's Team WE taking on Top Esports, with Top Esports picking up the 2-1 series win. Once again, WE are Game 1 Andes. There's just not even much to say about it at this point. It's so consistent that this team gets a comp they really like in game number 1, doesn't feel like they have to overforce a lot of situations, and you know, looks good in that instance. But the moment that they have to start, you know, being a bit more aggressive, maybe taking it to the enemy team a bit more, that's when things start to get bad very quickly. It's very, very funny to see. And one player really encapsulates that style and encapsulates the Game 1 Andy type of mentality. You know who it is. We'll talk about Monkey in just a bit. But for Top Esports, this is a pretty good win. They continue to show towards the end of these series why they're probably the #1 team in the entire league right now, because they just get to dominate on these really mechanically intensive picks, and they look fantastic doing so. The two players that have continuously pushed this team forward throughout the entirety of this year, Kanavi and Jackie Love, really stepping up once again in this series. Jackie Love mostly doing it in game number 2, but game 2 was one of those games where it's like, look at this draft. If you can enable this Lucian to really take over in the mid game, there is no way for WE to be able to play that out, and that's exactly what ended up happening. The Jarvan was in a great spot. I love the matchup into Xin Zhao, and then the Rise was basically utilized to just make sure Lucian had as easy a time as possible to take over. But in game number 3, it was the Kanavi show. He's going to get get player of the series. That Zed game in game number 3, man, it was absolutely ridiculous. What a powerful performance from him. He's one of the best Zeds in the world. Like, he just always has been really good at champions that are kind of like this and in this mold. But man, he really gets to showcase it now. The Zed into Olaf matchup in the jungle is not something I expected to see here today, but I am excited, and Kanavi really made the most of it. This was a Zed jungle masterclass in terms of the way he played the game. Really genuinely just took over and didn't allow any room for WE to get back into it. So credit to Kanavi, he was great. Already talked about Jackie Love. Hong continues to be fantastic down in the support position. He is really making a case to be that first team all-pro support. You know, I'm not sure he's going to be leading that argument, but he's certainly somewhere within it. He's going to be an all-pro here for basically everybody, or at the very least he should be. Kareem was really good in the mid lane. I think the second half of his split has been very good, much better than the first half of his split and really the rest of the year for him, specifically that spring split, which was kind of a nightmare. It's really nice to see him bounce back now that top esports feel like they're getting more comfortable again. 369's been good. Top lane's a difficult role to pin down, but 369 has been very good this split. Top esports are just awesome. They seem to be clicking on all cylinders right now, and you can kind of throw out game number 1 in terms of how this series went and just give them all the credit for games 2 and 3. And for WE, it's basically the opposite. You want to hang on to these game 1s so much and just kind of talk about how it gives you hope. It gives you, you know, this idea that maybe they can fight back in a couple of instances. It's just so hard to watch this happen over and over again and to feel good about it. Monkey is the obvious choice for dead of the series. He carries game number 1 on Skarner. He looks incredible as the setup for the team in that instance. And then he plays Olaf in game 3, one of his signature champions, and gets absolutely steamrolled by the Zed on the other side. Looks completely incompetent throughout the rest of this series. It's really just a bad look for Monkey. And honestly, a lot of the Monkey concerns have come up here in summer, where it just feels like this guy doesn't have a consistent play style. You know, there are multiple series where he'll make back-breaking errors around 15, 20 minutes that really end up costing the team. Remember, he was my dud of the week for week number 3 as a whole for the entirety of the LPL. The story has been the same. Monkey will have really good moments and really bad moments, and this is something we have seen in these breakout junglers in the past. Players like Milky Way last year or Bo, you know, many years before, where you know, they'll have the good moments, but you kind of have to ignore the bad moments in order to feel as excited about them. I'm much less excited about Monkey right now than I was earlier on in the year, and that's a really frustrating thing to say because I want this guy to be successful. I really liked him as a prospect coming up, and I liked him last year for EDG, but the concerning traits are there. Like, I'm not just going to ignore them. Rest of the team was also kind of bad in multiple moments, but not nearly as bad as Monkey. Like, Cube was fine, all things considered in this series, you know, expecting what we expect out of him. He wasn't, you know, getting rolled over. Karis was actually pretty good in the mid lane, which is kind of surprising. He's really good at getting resources. He's not always good at capitalizing on those resources, and while that wasn't all that different in this series, it's certainly something to note. Taeyun and Vampire are definitely weaker than they've been at other points this year, but I don't think they were the problem. It really just came down to the fact that Kanavi was better than Monkey in game 3, and that's really what turned everything. So WE continuing to be those game 1 Andes and continuing to really struggle to put everything together, and Top Esports with another nice win that ends up solidifying them. This is the best team in the LPL, and until proven otherwise, I'm going to stand on that take. But then moving on to our third series of day 6, our Super Day here, and our third series was a good one between Weibo Gaming and Invictus Gaming, where IG are going to pick up the 2-1 series win, and this team is on fire right now. Let's not forget that they beat some pretty important teams down the stretch of last week as well. This team is in really, really good form, and while I don't think everybody on the team is playing perfect, I think that there are some things that need to be improved upon. The overall vibe on IG is just phenomenal right now, and if anything, that scares me because I just hope it doesn't go away. I'm so excited by what this team has showcased itself to be that I want it to be able to be maintained. And then for Weibo, this is a bit of a disappointing loss, but honestly, you played really well in this series and you should have won 2-0. I'm not all that frustrated by how things ended up going. Like, would you have liked game 1 to be a win? Yes, because you played better in game 1 and you threw away this gigantic lead that you had generated for yourself. But at the end of the day, IG just have some sort of magic voodoo. This team has come back from multiple massive deficits throughout this year and yet have continued to win series. So let's go ahead and talk about it. The Shy, despite the KDA is going to be getting player of the series, this guy just continues to make impact after impact after impact on these games as a whole. He went 3-9 on the Gwen. I believe it was 3-9, something like that in game number 1. And he was by far the most important person towards winning that game and being able to come back. All of the gold on Weibo was funneled really threw the Shy in terms of how they were able to acquire it. He was the one that was giving over all the resources. He was dying so much in the early game, but again, that Gwen came up massive in game number 1. And then game number 3 on the Yorick, he's also not looking all that impressive from a KDA perspective, but go watch him play the game. He's 1v1ing people without Maiden and really creating massive problems for Weibo to be able to get through. This is the best the Shy has looked in many, many years. Again, I think this is the best version of him, especially domestically since like 2019. Like, I'm genuinely really excited about what he could be. This split has really been an outlier, though, for him. While he's been good throughout the rest of the year, I think he's been inconsistent. He's not really been that all-pro guy throughout all of 2025. It's been summer for the most part, but if he's going to be able to keep this up, if he is stepping up now that the team really needs him the most and that everything is really clicking, that is huge for this team. You know, Gala had another, Gala Kaisa game. If you want to give him player of the series for that Kaisa in game 3, I totally understand that. Hell, honestly, I kind of debated giving player of the series to Mako in the support position. I think he is really locking in right now. Talk about somebody who's very sneakily been terrible throughout a lot of this year. I guess not sneakily if you've watched the channel. He's just kind of been terrible if you follow my recaps, but Mako has been playing much better in summer. I think Gala has a lot more to work with, which is why he started taking over in a lot of these games, because I think he's starting to get a lot more comfortable playing early on in these series. I think Rookie has been incredible, the best player on this team, although the Shy really starting to take that award away from him now. Wei is the only concern I have. I still don't think Wei has looked like a superstar or anything on this team. I think that in clutch moments, he tends to kind of disappear for the team, which is really frustrating, but he's not been the worst jungler in the world. I just think they need him to be stable enough to be able to win elsewhere, because everything else on the team is just clicking. For Weibo, again, I can't be all that frustrated. You probably should have won this series 2-0 with the lead that you had in game 1, and then the fact that you were just straight up better in game 2, but just doesn't end up working out like that. I think that there were a couple of great performances here. Tien, I thought played really well, was probably the better jungler in this series, which is a good sign. Again, Tien needs to be a big piece. He's a former multiple-time MVP, a World Finals MVP that kind of was brought in for Weibo to be an upgrade to Tarzan, and that clearly has not worked out for the team, to be quite frank, but he has the tools and the skill set to be somebody that can come in and really elevate this team. I think Xiaohu was good. There were multiple moments in this series where I thought Xiaohu was better than Rookie. Light and Crisp were relatively consistent. The only real major negative I can give the team in this series is that Breathe was significantly worse than the Shy when it mattered the most. You know, Breathe has kind of shown himself to be a player that doesn't always step up in the biggest of moments, and while that is a bit of a concern, you just have to hope that you can neutralize that at least to some extent. I think the Cassante looked horrible in game 3, but really it's his Rumble in game number 1 that he's getting this award for, because really at the end of the day, they should have won game 1, and if the Rumble was a tad bit more effective, really in any role that he ended up, participating in, perhaps Weibo do end up winning this series. But at the end of the day, Weibo not able to cross that barrier into the top 4. This is not something that's new for the team, and Invictus picks up a really, really big win that puts them in a great spot. They're on fire right now. This team has looked as good as you could possibly ask for so far in summer. Again, the hope right now is just that they can keep it up throughout the playoffs. Then moving on now to day number 7, what would typically be the final day that we cover in a video, but again, we're covering both week 6 and week 7, but closing off week number 6, the day at the very least started off with a matchup between LNG Esports and LGD Gaming, where EDG gets some of their mojo back. They are able to pick up a very big win here. At this point, it's a little bit in vain because Ninjas and Pyjamas have guaranteed themselves that number 1 spot with the EDG loss, but at the end of the day, you're trying to get as much confidence as you can because you are still going into the play-in tournament. You still need to win a best of 5 in order to get into playoffs. For a lot of this split, that felt inevitable for LGD Gaming. Right now, I'm not quite as sure that that is the case. For LNG, this is them crashing back down to earth. There's just not a lot that they can do going up against a team like EDG with something to prove, and boy, did they prove something in this series, because what a series from Angel, who is going to get player of the series, easily the best he's played all year long. What a dominant performance on this Akali in game number 2. You can point to a lot of individual Angel games over the course of his career, obviously somebody who's made World Finals before back in 2020, but this might be one of the better ones. Like, truly, he just dismantled Haichao limb from limb in terms of how this matchup ended up going, and we'll talk about Haichao. Again, this is the guy who just gapped Satab, and this is the performance he goes out and puts in the next series. It's very funny, but Angel, I mean, a player that has kind of faded into the background for EDG because Xiaohao and Palkia and even ZDZ to like a lesser extent have really ended up shining more so for this team, but we know Angel can be a really good player. He's been successful, as I called out, but he's also been successful recently, even if his team success has not necessarily been there. A lot of the individual performances have still been very good from Angel over the past couple of years, and so to see him go 24-0 and 16 in this series, really, really cool stuff. Again, seeing him be able to step up and carry a game, very, very fun. wasn't the only player on the team to play well. Xiaohao and Palkia are the other two that I think really ended up being excellent. Palkia is just so good when he gets to play from ahead. Again, he's just like a way better version of OVO on the other side of this. OVO is a player I do kind of like, again, just from a mentality perspective, even if that comes out in negative ways over the course of a series. But Palkia is so much further along in terms of where his development is at, in terms of where he finds those engage angles and how exactly he positions in the mid game. Like, he's just so much better in that role right now. And I think we see it pretty consistently. He's one of the better supports in Group Nirvana. Like I said, Xiaohao was very good, dying once, mega gapping Xiaofeng on the other side. It's nice to see Xiaohao play a lot better than he did in that previous series. ZDZ was fine. You know, Zika's the best player. All you needed to do was neutralize him on the top side. And On was excellent as a follow-up, but again, didn't really have to do all that much as an active carry for the team. They try as hard as they can to make sure that On doesn't need to be the guy to 1v9 for them in the bot lane. And for the most part, they are successful. But Xiaohao, Angel, Palkia, really the players to watch out for EDG, and they stepped up here today. And for LNG on the other side, this is, again, the team that just beat Thunder Talk. Haichao just gapped Satab, and we saw good things, you know, at times out of other players on the team. But boy, howdy, was this absolutely terrible. One of the worst series you'll ever watch, especially from a mid laner. Haichao, the obvious choice for dud of the series. I mean, what happened here? This guy got absolutely massacred. This Azir was absolutely miserable in game number 2. Nothing to like about that performance. First and foremost, the Pantheon Azir mid-jungle duo is a very funny combo, because what are they even supposed to do? Like, how are you supposed to play around the Pantheon power spike when Azir is your mid laner? And how are you ever supposed to enable Azir in the late game when Pantheon is just going to die first in every single fight? It's a very weird combination. Don't necessarily love that, but you still have to survive in the early game. Azir should have that range advantage into Akali at the very least. At the very least, he should be able to function in this matchup, and he just was not capable of doing that. Miserable, miserable stuff from Haichao. Fish1 continues to prove that he's just not a tier 1 caliber player. I mean, this was awful stuff. Like, his positioning is just as bad as you could possibly ask for. The Yunara not working out at all in game 1. OVO, like I said, is a worse version of Palkia, and so there's not much to go off of there. Xiaofeng tried to be aggressive, but playing Lee Sin, playing Pantheon with no real follow-up coming in from any other member of the team is basically impossible, and Zika was stuck on tank duty. You put your best player on tank duty in both games, and he got completely neutralized. It's just not good from LNG. As much as we can say that they might not be the worst team in the league, because Thunder Talk really is that bad right now, they're certainly not good, and this is just another example of why this team is missing the play-in stage. And for Edward Gaming, they just need to start picking up the speed again, because this team was looking unstoppable at the beginning of Group Nirvana. If they can get back to that, which is essentially what they showed here in this series, then yeah, they're going to be a threat not only to make playoffs, but genuinely be an upset alert in those playoffs. But that's going to bring us to our final series of week number 6 and our second series of day number 7. And we closed off week 6 with a matchup between JD Gaming and Anyone's Legend, where AL are going to be able to pick up the 2-0 pretty easily here, all things considered. They look pretty fantastic across both of these games, and JDG just continues to showcase that they are not on the level of teams actually trying to win. AL, quite frankly, are not the strongest team of all time right now. Like, yes, their results are looking better towards the end of the split, but their schedule is also much easier. They've really struggled against actually good teams, and we've seen that pretty regularly. We saw that earlier this week against Top Esports. It's all well and good that they can beat up on FPX and JDG, but there are still concerns with this team, and I'm not going to just forget those because they're starting to win 2-0 in these series. But I guess we can talk about what exactly they did here. Flandra, the obvious choice for player of the series. I don't really think I have to go into that all that much. The Aurora, the Psy on both of those games, absolutely massive for him. Quite frankly, there was a gigantic diff in the top lane here. Xiaoshu's been a really good pickup for JDG, somebody that's coming in, quite frankly, been the most consistent piece of this team throughout the summer split, but this was not his best performance in the entire world. He kind of got mega gapped on the top side here, and Flandra really took advantage of the negativity that Xiaoshu was offering, and honestly, this might just be like a, hey, JDG, what were you doing last year with me? Why were you messing around and playing Sheer, or messing around and, you know, not treating either of us all that well as starting top laners? Like, this might have just been a bit of a revenge series for Flandra from a mental perspective, but either way, he ends up absolutely dominating it and really coming out of it looking as good as possible. Both game 1 and game 2 were really controlled by him, but I would say especially game number 2 on the Scion, there just was nothing they could do going into this Scion. There was no way for them to ever be able to break through him, and again, because of the lead he was able to generate on the top side of the map, there was not a lot of counterplay for JDG. Everybody else on the team was good as well. I think Kyle is going to go a bit under the radar for how good he was in terms of his engages in this series. Tarzan and Shanks, I thought, played off of each other great. Tarzan has a good series and is the better jungler in AL Win. Big surprise. Now, you know, that conversation can get a little bit murky, because typically speaking, when your jungler plays well, you win the game. That's just kind of true for League of Legends, but it's more so true for AL. That's the point I've always been trying to make. Ironically enough, Scout was fine in this series. I think he was probably the best player there on JDG in terms of the plays he was actively looking for. Maybe Pays, like Scout and Pays, I don't think were the problem in this series, but Shanks was still very good. Hope was fine, didn't really have to do anything in this series, was more so kind of backpacked and carried along for the rest of the team, but sometimes that can work out. AL were just kind of better in most lanes, and they certainly had better tempo. They destroyed game 2, and it's a good win for them. And then for JDG on the other side, I already talked about it a bit, but Xiaoxu was the obvious choice, I think, for dead of the series here. The Rumble, the Mbessa, both games, he was very much behind the 8 ball. I think specifically in game number 2, it really felt like that Mbessa was never going to be relevant. You want that champion to start snowballing early. I know that she can be viewed as a team fighter in the sense that she can be really effective with that ultimate in the later part of the game, and with enough gold, she can really like 1v9. She has that kind of potential, but really at the end of the day, Mbessa is an early game champ, and the fact that if you don't have that gold, it's kind of hard to pilot her in the same kind of way, and that's the same thing for Vi as well coming out of this jungle matchup. And so to lose so much tempo early on in this game made it impossible to play, and the Scion became really unkillable. You, again, can say similar things about the Rumble matchup into Aurora. I don't think everything ended up going right there, but I'll give a little bit of a pass to Xiaoxu because of just how bad the rest of this team has been for a majority of this year and how much he has been able to carry them in a lot of instances. So maybe his weakest series in a while, but certainly one that I think was, overdue in terms of his past performances in comparison to now. Shun continues to have a terrible second half of the year. He's been so good for this team throughout basically all of 2025. Him and Pays were really the only consistent pieces for JDG throughout the spring split. And now even Shun is starting to get out jungled basically every single game. Zhuo, I don't think was very good here. Pays wasn't the problem. He certainly wasn't the solution, but I'm not going to blame him for everything. And Scout, again, probably the best player on the Rift, maybe a bit over aggressive and over eager, but the Talia was actually fine in game number 2, was in a decent spot there, just couldn't actually convert into anything. But it's JDG losing to AL. Nobody's really surprised by this outcome. AL is the better team. JDG aren't going to be able to break through into that upper echelon. They're just a team that's pretty much locked into their spot as the number 6 team in the LPL unless something drastic ends up changing. No real surprises here. AL is better, and they close off week 6 with a pretty nice win. But now that we've wrapped up week number 6, it's time to jump into week number 7, our final week of action in the LPL regular season, and we kick off with our final Group Nirvana series of the entire split. It's Ultra Prime taking on LGD Gaming, and LGD are going to be able to close out their pretty decent Group Nirvana with another win here to get themselves that number 3 seed. There's nothing to play for. They already had the number 3 seed. Ultra Prime already had the number 4 seed coming out of Group Nirvana. There was nothing on the line stakes-wise in terms of how this went down, but it is still good to see LGD pretty confidently pick up a win here. Good for Ultra Prime getting a win in game number 1, but honestly, game 2, game 3, like they were pretty good. They were really solid from LGD. I think their macro was really good in particular in this series. This did not feel like a Group Nirvana series in terms of the gameplay, especially from LGD. So let's talk about it. Xiao Chenghua had a pretty great final week, or at least final 2 weeks if you really want to consider these separate. This was a really good showing and a really good performance from him. This is a player that I've ragged on a lot on this channel over his time in the LPL, but honestly, like with every other mid laner really feeling like a disaster right now, Haichao, Satab, like all of these other players that have kind of been nightmares, Xiao Chenghua has really elevated himself not even to bottom 2 with just his performance in the past 2 series alone, which is really cool to see because this is a player that, is kind of a rookie here in the LPL, doesn't have a ton of experience playing Tier 1 League of Legends, and you want to see players like that figure it out. Maybe they're not so good day 1 and maybe they have some problems, but they can continue to grow and evolve over their time in the LPL. That's exactly what you want to see from players like this. And I think he did show that level of development. He got to play more aggressive carries like the Yone and the Aurora in the back half of the series, which I think really helped. But honestly, he just had a great week overall, and he really kind of pushed LGD forward because of his prio in the mid lane. I think Savior is the other player in this series that ended up playing really well. Savior is an interesting player because while I don't think he's like incredible, I don't think he's terrible. Like, I think this is a guy that can stick around in the LPL, maybe never be like a true difference maker, but, I would hate to see him get replaced after this year. I think he has shown enough. Him and YCX both, I think as a duo, have shown enough to convince me that they probably should just be running this duo back going into next year. I would have told you that the changes probably needed to come from the mid lane, but again, maybe not even that at this point with Xiao Chenghua showing so much more at the end of the split. Climber's probably been this team's weakest player, but you invested in him as a really big former prospect. He was the best player in the LDL out of everybody on this team, and so you kind of hope that he's going to be able to figure it out. Sasa, I thought, had a pretty crazy week, all things considered. LGD just looked great in terms of what we've talked about in this video, and this was a phenomenal way for them to close out a split that, was pretty good, all things considered. And then for Ultra Prime on the other side, not the worst showing of all time from them either. I think that there were multiple things that they actually did really well. Game 3 wasn't exactly a blowout, neither was Game 2, despite the fact that it ended sub 25 minutes. Ultra Ultra Prime held their own in this series, but at the end of the day, their macro was significantly worse than LGD, and therefore they weren't really able to compete at the same level. Junhao, for me, is going to get done of the series, pulls out his classic Nefiri jungle in game number 3, and is not able to keep up with kind of the performances maybe he had in the previous split. That really was his bread and butter pick that got Ultra Prime into some good spots and almost into Group Ascend, if we remember that. Not so much here in game number 3. Nefiri has been nerfed quite a bit since then, but at least Junhao was willing to pull it out, and honestly, I feel bad because Junhao's going to end with some pretty bad player of the series, dud of the series metrics for me at the end of the split, but this was an okay one. I think it was definitely worse than Spring because the carry meta wasn't quite as strong, but hopefully, you know, you can continue to build on that. And again, this team does have a play-in series to be able to win, and everybody else in the team was fine here. I think Xiao was pretty good in the support position. He was great in game 1 on the Alistar. I think Baya was very good in game 2. If he wasn't disastrous in game 3, you know, I would be hyping him up a bit more. But honestly, you know, if you're just talking about game 3, Baya was probably the weakest player on the team in this series. So that's something to take away. Saber was whatever. Jung was also kind of whatever on the top side. I'm not saying that they ended up like blowing out the series, but I expected a lot worse between these two teams for the final Group Nirvana series, and generally was just kind of walking away impressed with the gameplay that we saw. Ultra Prime was fine, not terrible, and they just didn't have the firepower to beat an LGD team that executed very well on their own draft principles. So, you know, overall pretty fun to see, and both of these teams hopefully can step up in their plans. But then moving on to our second series of day number 1 here, and our second series was a pretty good one. It was Bilibili Gaming taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and BLG pick up the win, but this is not the same FPX team that you might remember from the last couple times we've talked about them, because they have a new jungler coming in. IYY has been benched, and Jeje is in here as the starting jungler for the team. This is a pretty big pickup, and honestly, if this had happened at any point earlier on in the split, especially before Milky Way ended up joining, perhaps FPX would have the resources and the time to be able to figure out how to be relevant in Group Ascend, because I honestly think Jeje is good enough to be able to drag this team above last place in Group Ascend. He's arguably a top 3 jungler in the entire league, but it's just not going to happen with this little time. It's going to be so hard for these guys to get on the same page, and we already saw that in this first series. BLG are exactly the team that they were the last time we talked about them, and that's the most frustrating part, is that they constantly put themselves in the same position, which is that they are so good at generating resources, and they have no clue what to do at the end of the game. Like, genuinely, they might be the worst late game team in the LPL. They are actually horrendous in that phase, and I don't know if it's just Shadow shot calling or whatever, but no lead is safe for Bilibili. Like, they can throw literally any game. It's actually just ridiculous how bad this team is in terms of their macro and their gameplay in the late game, but yet they're still able to walk out with a couple of victories. Let's go ahead and talk about the games themselves. Knight kind of has to be player of the series here. Like, could it possibly go to anyone else? Nobody else was even remotely consistent enough. Shadow was very important down the stretch of game number 2 on the Xinjiao, but he was part of the reason why they almost lost game number 1. And again, I think the macro of Shadow has been terrible for this team. And so it ends up being something that kind of negates his ability to win player of the series. Elk and On were more negative than positive, I would say, despite their good score lines in this series. Bin was the only other player I think even trying to win this game for BLG. But at the end of the day, Knight was absolutely carrying them, as he has done for a majority of this year. If they just had a good mid laner and not Knight, I don't think this is a top 4 team. Like, genuinely, I think they need the best player in the league in order for this team to be relevant. And yeah, like, having Knight versus not having Knight is a pretty big difference. But like, I want to make it clear, the surrounding core on this team has not been good. Like, they've not been good to the point where, you know, if they didn't have a superstar in the mid lane, if they didn't have one of the best players in the league, like, even if they just had a good one, they would not be relevant. I just really think that that is the difference for BLG right now. But luckily they do have Knight, and he continues to carry a lot of these late games because he is just so talented. It's hard for him to lose. Like, genuinely, it's hard to lose games with Knight as your mid laner, but he continues to be, you know, a menace and just absolutely dominating. Care continues to be a bit of a problem on the other side for FPX, but, you know, who else do I even highlight here? Bin was good. I don't think Bin was a problem, but Sheer was also pretty good on the other side of this matchup, and so I don't want to sit here and say it was a gigantic top cap, because that doesn't feel like it's correct. Shadow had some big moments on the Xinjiao, but again, I thought the Vi game was pretty terrible in game number 1, and the macro continues to be a problem, not just in this ubiquitous sense that we know that Shadow is shot calling, but specifically the decisions that Shadow is making in-game, like, for his own movement in the back half of games. That's absolutely terrible. Elk and On had multiple moments where they were just not useful in the back half of this game, despite the fact that he was playing Yunara in game number 1. it just doesn't feel good for BLG. Honestly, I'm walking out of the series feeling worse about BLG because they showed all of the negative traits that we've gotten used to from them against FPX of all teams. And yes, FPX has improved with Jeje, but are they? Because let's talk about it. Like, Jeje did not look comfortable with this team, especially in Game 2 on the Pantheon. He's actually getting dud of the series for me because I do think he was the biggest negative, although not the only negative on the team. And I'm not really blaming him as a player. I still think Jeje is arguably a top 3 jungler in all of the LPL. I really am that high on him as a player, but it's clear that he has not had a ton of scrim time with the rest of this team because the synergy is just not there right now for FPX. Hopefully they can figure it out moving forward, but Jeje did not look good, and I think Care is a part of that problem. I think it's really hard for Jeje to play when his mid laner is quite bad. Care is just not, a Group Ascend caliber mid laner. He's going to be a lot closer to what we were talking about with a lot of those negative mid laners down in Group Nirvana, and I think we've seen that pretty consistently. Care has just never realized that potential he had in 2023. Like, he showed a lot of flashes, he showed a lot of potential, and then 2024 was a bad year, and now 2025 is a bad year, and it really just feels like he's going to be one of those prospects who never really figures it out at this level. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he does end up getting to a point where he can step up. We know he is at the very least a little bit clutch because his playoff performances have always been his best games, but, his regular season's too bad. He can't really hold on to that mentality. Rest of the team was fine. Jauchi and Jue weren't exactly a problem. I would say the bot lanes were relatively equal in terms of actual raw gameplay, even if the production was much higher on the side of BLG. And Sheer was genuinely very good in this series. He'll have multiple performances where he'll look like this. He's just not consistent. But, he's super young still, and he didn't have any experience in the LPL before last year. This is still a player that can be a threat at the LPL level in the right circumstances. And again, there's a lot of talent on this team, but it's probably too little too late for FPX to be able to figure it out. And BLG, at the very least, are going to be able to take advantage of that fact. They're not consistent. Their late game macro is terrible, but they've got some really good players. They've got Knight in the mid lane, and sometimes that really is enough. But then moving on now to day number 2 of this final 7th week here in the LPL. We kicked off day 2 with a matchup between Team WE and Invictus Gaming, where IG are going to pick up the 2-0 victory. And while it looks pretty clean in terms of the scoreline, I think that there are a lot of underlying things to talk about for both of these squads because, quite frankly, both of them have quite a bit to play for. IG, of course, having locked themselves in the playoffs, but this team is not content with just being a good team. They want to be a team that can compete to win the LPL. And so you want to make sure that everything they're doing is on board and, they're pushing the game forward as quickly as possible. Their macro's good, their side laning's good, all of that stuff. You want to make sure they have a complete package. And for WE, it's basically the opposite. Right now, they're guaranteed to be in a spot where they have to win or they go home. And it's going to be a matchup that they should be able to win against a team like LGD Gaming, likely in the play-in stage, but it's certainly not one that is guaranteed for them by any stretch of the imagination. And you need to make sure that this team is on point, not only in terms of the gameplay that they've already shown because of the confidence, but because you need to make sure that they can do it at all. And right now, that still is a question mark. This team looked quite bad in this series, but we'll talk about it from IG's perspective. They weren't the cleanest team, but they certainly, were aggressive and they were better in terms of their execution, which kind of got them over the top here. Wei, for me, is going to be the obvious choice for player of the series. It really did feel like he dominated both of these games in terms of how much he was creating on the map. The Poppy in Game 1 was really excellent. The Trundle in Game 2 was arguably even better from him. Just really great at him being able to set up and follow through a lot of the engages that IG really wanted to point towards. And honestly, I was impressed with Wei here. He's kind of been the weak link of this team so far this split. Not in a way where he's been a huge negative, but just that he's like the one really inconsistent player that they do still have on the roster. Everybody else has kind of locked it in at least a little bit over the course of summer. But I think he showcased in this series in particular that he still has a lot going for him. Rookie continues to be a really big positive. It's funny, every time Wei plays even average, like just okay enough, Rookie has an unbelievable series, and it's almost as if Rookie can get into a spot where he can create basically everything, that even his jungler that is inconsistent is going to be just fine. If you wanted to give Rookie player of the series, I'm not going to be all that upset by that. I think you could argue the Orianna game in Game 1 was just as good, if not better, than the Poppy game from Wei. The Ahri in Game 2 has a very similar story with the Trundle. Either way, the jungle mid duo was really the separator here, despite the KDA of the bot lane. Gala ends up going 17-0 and 15. Still a very good series from him, where he very much outplayed a lot of what Taeyun and Vampire were putting out, but I don't think he was necessarily the main character like his KDA would indicate. We'll get to Vampire. He played terrible in this series, and Mako was very much able to take advantage of that. The Shy was way better than Cube in terms of how to play the side lane and just be able to enable his Cho'Gath in Game 2. Just a good series from IG. Maybe there are some things you'd like to clean up from like a personal perspective. The Shy, Wei, Mako maybe overextending it a couple of times, but those are nitpicks. I think IG is still showing across this week that they deserve to be considered one of the best teams in the entire league. For WE on the other side, I'm worried about this team, man. I don't think they're competent. Like, I don't think they're competitive. Right now, I'm expecting them to lose a play-in series with the way that they're playing right now because it has not looked good for them. I get it. It's IG. It's a series that they probably should be losing. And Monkey, I thought, was better here than he has been recently. And that's certainly saying something because at least in game ones, he's still been very good. But, oh boy, did we have a bad performance out of multiple players. I think Cube and Vampire were basically unplayable in this series. Vampire more so for game number 1 on the Nico. That was just about as much of a disaster class as you can have on Nico as possible. I mean, actively like full whiffing Nico ultimates, which is just completely unacceptable at the pro level. Terrible setups, bad positioning. Vampire did not play well here today against his former mentor in Mako. And then Cube is the one who's actually going to be getting dead of the series because the entire draft in game 2 is built around this York. It's built around setting up side lanes and making sure that you can prioritize that in the mid to late game, buy as much time for him as possible. And Cube, first of all, can't side lane. And second of all, this team played around him about as miserably as possible. I think Cube's performance in this series kind of solidifies the WE don't really have a variable of options in terms of how they can play the game. They need to stick to those team fighting comps because Cube is just not good enough, first off, on the top side to be able to lane against someone like the Shy and be able to keep up. But even more so than that, this team has no clue what they're doing macro-wise when they have to do anything other than front-to-back team fight. It's just not something WE has in their arsenal right now. So Cube has a lot of problems he needs to fix. Vampire just played his worst series of the split. Taeyun was completely irrelevant, and in fact, his positioning in this series was quite bad. Karis was bad in the mid lane. Monkey was the only player even attempting to do anything in Wei. Still was better on the other side. Like, it was just a bad showing from WE. I'm pretty out on this team. I think there is a real shot they don't even make playoffs at this point. And for Invictus on the other side, this is a really nice win. Again, you just keep compounding all these wins over and over again. They've had a phenomenal week 6, week 7 combo video here so far. They've just been on fire, and their series is not over. I guess their split is not over just yet. They still have one more, I believe, to play in the regular season, but it's already looking pretty good for a team that might be one of the favorites to win the entirety of the LPL. Then moving on to our second series of day 2 of week number 7, and our second series was a matchup between FunPlus Phoenix and Top Esports, where TES are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Not much I can say about this that I haven't already said in this exact video about both of these teams 100 times over. This is FPX's, I think, 4th series of the video. Top Esports already making a couple of appearances as well. I think it's their 3rd, and so you know what I'm going to say about these two. The only thing I really want to talk about is the fact that FPX did put up a fight in this series, and I think on paper this roster is quite scary. I think Jeja comes in here as a borderline all-pro caliber jungler. You have Jue, who's a really good support and started to step up again in this series. Jachi was the best player for FPX in this series. He tried to 1v9 for a majority of it. That's cool. I think Sheer has had a couple of good performances. It's really just Care in the mid lane that's holding FPX back now in terms of being genuinely competitive, but somehow, some way, they've turned this roster into something that I am at least decently interested in if they can get, you know, under the same page in that same way. But Top Esports is not the team to do that against. They are the best team in the LPL. They continue to look excellent in terms of their macro. Go watch this game 3. It's utter domination, and they do it through all these macro-oriented picks in the middle of the map. And I think it's specifically Kanavi who just has the weirdest champion pool right now in the LPL that makes it so exciting. But he's not player of the series. Cream is player of the series in the mid lane. Pretty obviously, the Rise game in game 3 was massive. He really was the one that was enabling every offensive play that TES ended up going for, but it wasn't just game 3. I think the Aurora in game number 1 was also very good. Mid lane's not strong right now in the LPL. I know I've made a point to say that. It's like Knight and then everyone else, but you know, in a sea of Rookie and Xiaohu potentially being good team fighters but not good laners, and Shanks having one of the weaker splits he's had in quite a while, you have a player in Cream who I think is very under the radar, just been good for Top Esports throughout basically all of this split. Again, split 2, like the spring split was really the one that people locked in on and were like, okay, he's kind of taking that step back. We didn't expect him to really be able to maintain his spot as a top 2 mid laner, and here is, you know, the example of that. Tier 2 was, or a split 2, I should say, was not a great showcase, but I think he's gotten back a lot of that, you know, energy here in split 3 in the summer split. I think, you know, with Kanavi playing better and certainly with Jackie Lev feeling a lot more inspired with Hong in the bot lane, I think it's opened the door for Cream to be a lot more aggressive as a mid laner, and I think he's taken full advantage of it. But how do you not talk about the Kiana in game 3? Kanavi pulling out Kiana jungle and looking pretty good on it. Honestly, it was very effective. He was better than Jeja for sure in that 3rd game, and there's a conversation to be had about Jeja. He's played 2 series so far, and he's not looked particularly good in either of them, but again, new player coming in, so I'll give give him some slack, but Kanavi pulling out Kiana in a matchup that doesn't really matter and securing himself first place in the LPL with it is very, very cool. The Zed, the Kiana, like all these assassins coming out could really spark like a playstyle idea for top esports that could be very difficult to deal with if they end up playing at their best. Rest of the team was great. Jackie Love continues to be awesome, even if he died way too much in this series. Hong was awesome in this series. He is really stepping up. Like, he's making a strong case to be the best support in the LPL right now, genuinely, in terms of his gameplay. 369 also very good on the top side, but top esports looking solid, man. Like, I really like the direction this team is headed in. I just hope they're going to be able to keep it up. And then for FPX on the other side, already talked about it a bit, but man, Jachi was good. Like, he tried his absolute best to 1v9 this series, and he kind of did in game number 2 on the Varus, where he really took over and was able to take full advantage of how strong that pick can be. He gets the Ziggs in game 3, and I think a lot of people get really frustrated by this because he comes off of a carry performance and immediately is put on this kind of champion that is generally considered to be less carryable, but his Ziggs game was excellent in game 3. Again, kept them in it, really tried to 1v9 and keep FPX alive in that series. It just didn't really end up happening. I think Jway deserves a lot of credit as well for that. I think the bot lane in general just played well. You know, it doesn't make up for the fact that Jway's been kind of bad over the course of the rest of this week, but, you know, this was definitely his best series of the week that we've covered today in this video. I will say easy choice for dud of the series. It's going to Care. The only one who was in contention for this outside of him was Jeje in the jungle. Like I said, a couple of rough performances, mostly that game 1 on the Trundle that I didn't really like out of Jeje, but Care was just worse than Cream in basically every aspect. He plays the Akali in game 3. That doesn't work out. He plays the Talia in game 1. That doesn't really work out. It just doesn't feel like Care is ever going to be able to compete with Group Ascend level mid laners. I'm giving up on the hype that we saw out of him a couple of years ago, and, you know, at this point, I'm willing to say that he's probably just a below average mid laner at this level. Again, hopefully he can figure something out. We've seen players have, you know, resurgent breakthroughs, but I just don't really expect that to happen with him, and until that happens, like, FPX might still just not be a good enough team to make the playoffs. They've made a ton of changes to get themselves in there, and I do think there is a chance that they could beat a team like Ninjas in Pyjamas with the roster that they have constructed, but their backs are up against the wall, and for top esports, this is a really good team. They are the favorites right now in the LPL. Them and Invictus have both been absolutely on fire over the course of this week so far, and if this is the TES that shows up to playoffs and, God forbid, shows up to Worlds in an actual international tournament, they have to be considered one of the stronger teams in the world, quite frankly. Then moving on now to day number 3, our penultimate day here in this video to go over so many games. We're almost there, and luckily for day 3, I was able to cast this one live as well, so I will get to be a bit quicker on the analysis. Kicking off day 3 was a matchup between Weibo Gaming and LGD Gaming. Not the last time we are going to see these two face off in the last 2 days of the regular season because of all of the storms and all of the rescheduling that had to happen, but this time Weibo Gaming is able to pick up the victory in pretty dominant fashion. Game 1 was a little bit longer than maybe it needed to be, but eventually they got to the point where they were able to close it out because Light got super fed on the Corki, and, you know, that Pantheon ended up just being a bit too strong to deal with. Breathe was very strong on the Aurora in game number 1 as well, but game 2 definitely much more clean from Weibo. They kind of really took it to JDG, and there wasn't a lot that they were going to be able to do to push back on that. This is the result I think we all expected. Weibo Gaming, clearly the 5th best team in the league. JDG, clearly the 6th best team in the league, just in terms of how things are breaking down. This is consequential, though, because it locks Weibo in as that number 5 seed. Theoretically, if JDG had won both of the series between these two teams over the back end of the regular season, it could swing back around in the other direction with JDG getting the 5 seed and Weibo dropping to 6, but you know, you both want to make sure you can get that 5 seed because you'd much rather play Ultra Prime than basically anybody else going into the play-in stage. But talking about the games themselves, Tien is the obvious choice for player of the series. He ran both of these games in terms of his early aggression and just what he was able to put down on the map. The Pantheon, massive in game 1. The Xin Zhao still very good in game number 2. We'll talk about it a bit when we get to JDG. Massive jungle gap here, but I was very vocal on the cast about how Tien should be player of the series. I'm going to stick to my word and give him player of the series here. Do want to give a shout out to both Breathe and Light because I think both of them were very good. Light has been much better, I would say, over the past 2 or 3 series. It doesn't forgive all the sins of the beginning of this split because I do think that there have been way too many games where he's just been quite bad for me to just, you know, say he's back or anything like that, but it definitely feels a lot better right now for Light than it has at other times. Breathe, I think, was really good here. Breathe has been very good throughout the second half of this split, and I think is sneakily like an all-pro caliber guy just because top lane's not been all that good. Xiaoshu's another player that would have been in contention for one of those all-pro spots, but Breathe just completely manhandled him here today in terms of just gapping him on the other side, and so he probably takes a bit of precedent. I like Xiaohu. I had a whole thing about him in the pre-show. Crisp was solid. Overall good stuff from Weibo. I should say more than solid. The Renata game in particular in game 2 was massive from Crisp, and I agree with Mazel. He probably could have been player of the game for game number 2, but overall, just a great series from Weibo, definitely the better team here. And for JDG, they just don't have the firepower to be able to compete. Everybody kind of underperforming. Mid-jungle was terrible. Shown is the obvious choice for dead of the series, as we talked about extensively on the cast. Wukong, Skarner, both of those games he ends up getting incredibly outpaced and is not relevant really at any point. Like, Tien was so much better than him, it was actually astounding in terms of how this matchup went down. Scout was also very bad in the mid lane here, especially on the Galio in game 1, but the Sylas wasn't much better. He never once took Renata ultimate. How is that even possible? You have to accidentally click on Renata at some point when you're Sylas. It just feels ridiculous and kind of ludicrous. Xiaoshu was outplayed on the top side. Zhuo has still been fine for this team. I don't want it to seem like he's been a negative. He's probably been better for this team than Wink was, if only because Pays has started to play better, but it's not like he himself is offering all that much, and Pays was not able to take over in this series at all. So JDG struggling right now, man. They're definitely better than WE and FPX. I think that has become clear, but it doesn't really feel like they're on the same level as any team that actually knows what they're supposed to be doing, which is really frustrating for a roster of this kind of talent. But for Weibo, they look pretty good here. There's still a chance that Weibo starts peaking at the end of the season and randomly makes Worlds and then goes to the semifinals. We've seen this story before when it comes to this organization. I'm not going to throw out that possibility is very much, realistic for them, but for now they feel like the clear-cut, team to beat. They're not quite top 4, but they're the gatekeepers for everybody else. But that's going to bring us to our second series of day number 3, and one of the bigger upsets I've gotten the chance to cast, Team WE taking on Anyone's Legend, where WE are going to pick up the strong 2-0. I say one of the bigger upsets. I've cast a lot of the upsets this split, haven't I? I casted the FPX win over IG, I've casted WE over AL. Doesn't really feel like anything ever goes according to plan when I'm on the desk. Maybe that's, something to keep track of, but certainly a fun one to talk about here because WE just outplayed them. This was not close. This was not AL fumbling the bag and not, taking advantage of their leads. This was them just being worse in almost every single area. Flandra was the only player on the team today that actually stepped up and did anything, and that's really frustrating for AL because they need to start getting their shit together going into playoffs, and this was supposed to be the get-right end of the regular season for them. They played FPX, they played JDG, they've played WE, and yet somehow they're not walking out of that 3-0. It's utterly ridiculous. They didn't take a single game in this series, and WE, what a win for them. They need to build some confidence going into play-ins because this week was pretty terrible for them, but quite frankly, they outplayed AL here today, which is huge. Karis is going to get player of the series. There was a gigantic mid-gap in this series. Karis is mostly getting this for the Akali in game number 2, but it's not like he was worse on the Galio in game number 1. He still was excellent on the Galio, and the Akali was really, really dominant. I mean, it completely took over that second game. Not only did Shanks have no way to deal with it in a side lane, in a very good matchup for Talia, but even more so than that, Karis completely dominated every team fight, and Shanks wasn't able to do anything throughout a majority of this game. Honestly, massive stuff from Karis. Really big step-up moment from him. I'm not turning around my opinions on him because he's had good games in the past, and, we've seen him have flashes of being a solid player before, but never really be able to put anything together. I think that's probably what this is, but at the very least, we saw it against AL, and that is a good sign. Cube was excellent in this series. Talk about a guy who's been nightmarishly bad for a majority of this split, just stepping up in the most random of times with absolutely nothing on the line. The Rumble was huge in game 1. He absolutely deserved that player of the game. I will die on that hill. The damage he was able to do in those team fights was massive, and he really won them game 1. And then the Jace was also shockingly big in game 2 as well, in terms of the damage. Monkey was great. Taeyun and Vampire, I think, were really solid. Vampire had a couple of great engages. Taeyun was more of a background player in this series, but still, overall, fine enough, even if he did die in a couple of unnecessary circumstances. WE was better across the board. That is massive for them in terms of confidence building, especially because this is their last series of the regular season. But for Anyone's Legend on the other side, what is going on with this team, man? It is actually just absurd how inconsistent they are. How can I try and, facilitate conversation surrounding AL that isn't just Tarzan win, they win, Tarzan lose, they lose? Because the rest of this team, they're not stars. And I think we are realizing that very quickly. I still like Kyle, and I think he is the one player that, despite not playing all that well today, you can give a bit of an exception to. I think will be fine moving forward, but Shanks and Hope, I'm sorry, man, I'm out. Like, I'm starting to buy out. I like Hope as somebody who can, capitalize on good game states. He's not going to elevate your team. He's going to be a product of how good your team is. And Shanks, quite frankly, might just be bad. Like, this guy has been not only very bad throughout a majority of summer, and by the way, he's dead of the series, but this is a trend. And I talked about it earlier this week. This guy gets worse as the year goes along. He continuously starts to play worse and worse and worse the longer games go. I don't know why that is. Again, I just have to imagine he's getting fatigued or something, and that's happening every year, but this is a real trend with Shanks at this point that you cannot overlook. It is just reality for who he is as a player. Hopefully, he can figure things out going into playoffs, because if he can't, this team's in a bad spot. Tarzan got out jungled by Monkey, and that is not possible. Like, that can't happen for AL to be able to win. Flandra was solid, and I think, again, Kyle played one of his weaker series of the split, and you're not expecting him to do that again, but AL's macro is not good enough to be able to withstand the bad early games, quite frankly, the bad decision-making that they're having in this series. So, go watch my cast live, because I was very frustrated there, and I continue to be frustrated, but for WE, this is massive. This is a huge win for them. That really does change kind of the outlook of what this team is. They have a big matchup against EDG, some former EDG players like Monkey and Vampire facing their former org for a chance to make the playoffs. It's a big, big test for Team WE, and if they were ever going to pass it, it's definitely coming off of this win. But that's going to bring us to our final day of action here in the LPL throughout this mammoth video that we are putting out. Thank you guys so much for sticking around for the entire thing. But kicking off our final day of the regular season was a matchup between Weibo Gaming and JD Gaming. Wait a second, didn't we just have this the day before? Yes, we did. This final day is actually a little bit weird because it's not your regular final day of the regular season. That was supposed to be the previous day, but there were 2 series that actually got canceled because of the storms throughout the regular season, and they were made up for here as the new final day, and that means Weibo and JDG play back-to-back, this time for significantly less, and that's when JDG steps up and picks up the 2-1 series win. The moment that the stakes are gone, the moment that there is nothing left to play for. If JDG had won both of these series against Weibo, they could have gotten that number 5 seed, but alas, at this point, it's just for pride. That being said, it's still nice to see that JDG have the option to win. It's not something that has always been in their repertoire in terms of how things are going, so it's nice to see that that's available, and for Weibo, this is a bit of a disappointing performance because I do think they were putting something together towards the end of the regular season, but really, again, pretty meaningless, all things considered. Let's get into it, though. Player of the series for me might be a little bit of a shock, but I'm going to give it to Scout in the mid lane. This guy has been quite terrible, and he has pretty reasonably been dogged on by the community for a majority of the split, so I wanted to give him a bit of praise on the final day here because he did just kind of outplay Xiaohu, who is kind of an all-pro candidate, and this might be one of those series that ends up not getting him all-pro. No spoilers for the end of the video, but Scout really outplayed him in terms of their wins here. Both the Talia and especially the Annie game in game number 3 were massive, and I think he really was the one that was creating the most for JDG. You can give Shun a lot of credit, and I will give Shun a lot of credit. I do think he was very good, and there were times where Scout was over-eager, especially on the Galio in game number 2, but for the most part, I think this was just a very good series overall from him, and one of his better ones of the split. I think he's had a couple of good performances that have just been overshadowed by just how bad the bad games have ended up looking, so hopefully this is something that ends up feeling a bit better for Scout closing out the regular season, but Shun also getting a bit of revenge after getting mega gapped by Tien just a day ago. Pulls out the Neferi in game number 3 and ends up really carrying. Tien pulls out the Kiana in game number 2 and picks up a win on that. A couple of very fun jungle picks over the course of this series, but Shun's got to get back into form. Shun and Scout, the 2 players who stepped up here today, are probably the 2 most relevant players towards whether or not JDG can even live up to their own hype going into the playoffs. I think there is an off chance, a non-zero chance that this is a team that doesn't even make the playoffs. Like, it is technically possible for a team that has performed the way that they have to just lose a play-in series. I'm certainly not expecting that. We'll get to my predictions at the end of the video here, but if they are going to step up and be a team that can compete to make top 5 or even top 4 if everything were to go right, Shun and Scout have to be the 2 that end up propelling that forward. Xiaoxu was fine, certainly better than Breathe, but had a couple of moments where I think he was too far forward. Pays and Zhuo were much better. Again, it feels like Pays is much more comfortable playing with Zhuo than he ever was playing with Wink. He had some really good moments with Missing, but Missing was also a nightmare individually, and so even if Zhuo is not the best player in the world, it's honestly quite clear that of the 3 supports that have played for JDG this year, he's probably the best one for the team, which I never would have expected. Not that I've always been out on Zhuo. I'm not trying to turn my thought process and analysis around because, that would be relatively unfair, but remember, I've always been a bit more patient with Zhuo, mostly because he's had to play with Photic throughout basically his entire career, and that guy is terrible, so For JDG, this is a nice win, and for Weibo, pretty frustrating loss. Again, you're not thinking about it too much because it's clear that this team just wasn't trying all that hard, but game number 2 was solid, and so maybe you can just look at that and go, well, they clearly were at least attempting to win, and they just didn't. Tien ends up getting out jungled by Shun throughout most of this series. The Kiana game was just so massive that it's hard for me to be really mad at him. I think Light was also pretty solid. Crisp had a couple of nice playmaking moments, but for the most part, dud of the series was very obvious. It is going to go to Xiaohu in the mid lane. Really, Scout was just better here today. That's not really been the case over the course of this year or this split, so a bit of a surprise there, but we know Xiaohu can have a bad day on any given day. That's just kind of the player that he is. The good games are definitely still there for him, but you can't discount the fact that there are always going to be some negative ones. This might even be his weakest series of the entire split, which is definitely a frustrating time for it to happen. Breathe wasn't great, Crisp wasn't great, but again, I want to reiterate, this is just a meaningless end of split series. There was nothing to play for here, especially after Weibo kind of proved that they were better than JDG yesterday. We'll see how it ends up translating into the play-ins and the playoffs and how these two teams end up performing, but I'm really not going to read into this result all that much. I think that there is more to gain from the series the day before this than this one, in my particular opinion. But that's going to bring us to our final series of this video. Again, thank you so much if you've stuck around this long. It's been a crazy journey to get this 2-hour video out, but I do appreciate you sticking around. And ending off our regular season was a matchup between Invictus Gaming and Bilibili Gaming, where Invictus Gaming are going to pick up the 2-0 victory. Quite frankly, they're just going to play better than BLG in this particular performance, and there's a lot to take away from this. Unlike what we saw earlier on day number 4 here, I think there actually is a lot to read into in terms of how these two teams broke down, mostly because IG had a phenomenal week. They were unstoppable throughout basically all of week 6 and week 7, and BLG have looked not very good towards the end of the regular season. Now, whether that actually translates into playoff form, I think is certainly up for debate because these two teams can be rather finicky, but generally speaking, it's cool to see IG doing well, and it's a little bit concerning to see BLG not doing so well, and I think if you're reading off of regular season performances, you certainly have one of these teams doing better in the playoffs than the other. So let's talk about IG, the team that is on fire right now. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to Gala. He wasn't the only player to play well. I think Wei actually was much better than his KDA would indicate, but he certainly was the one to kind of push the team forward. And Yunara and Sivir in these late game team fights, that's really the difference, especially when Elk on the other side of this matchup was getting caught out over and over again, leading his team in deaths, just constantly in bad positions. Gala being able to take advantage of that and team fight into a really good spot is just hugely positive. Remember, Gala's biggest problem at the beginning of this split and at the end of spring was the fact that he was starting to become inconsistent in the 5v5s, that he was stepping too far forward and he was out of position. That's all gone. I think the last 3 weeks have really proven that Gala is back into being Gala. Like, there is no more question about whether or not this guy is going to be able to figure it out. He has figured it out. I was already much higher on his spring split than most. I am definitely high on his summer split. He's been one of the best AD carries in the entire league over the course of this split, and the second half has been really kind to him. So awesome for Gala. He really stepped up here today. But again, I do want to give credit to IG because these games weren't exactly easy or perfect. You got to give some credit to the Shy for being the one to end game number 2, ends up utilizing the Mord ultimate to continue to hit the Nexus and ends up taking the game. You know, game 2 wasn't locked or set in stone. You know, game 1 really even wasn't like all that locked up. Like, it wasn't a blowout in any direction. It's just that BLG's macro and their late game is so bad that IG knew that if they got to that point, it wouldn't really matter, which we'll talk about when we get over to BLG. But, you know, the Shy ends up winning that. I think Wei had a very good series. Again, not necessarily indicated by his KDA. I actually thought he was better than Shadow here today. Had multiple moments on the Vi where the engages were nearly perfect, so definitely want to give him a shout out there. Rookie, Mako, I think they were solid as well. IG just kind of feel inevitable right now in terms of the way that they're playing. Top Esports is the only other team that I can think of that's even remotely on that level, and it's arguable that IG is better than them right now, especially because of the results when those two teams have played against each other over the course of this year. So for IG, there is a real conversation about them being the best team in the LPL, which they've got to be unbelievably stoked about. And for Bilibili on the other side, there are real issues with this team. And I shouldn't even say issues. There is one really gigantic issue with this team, and it's the fact that no matter how big their lead, no matter how good their early and mid game, no matter how good their setup is, they cannot close games. They just do not know how to do it. This is like the 5th or 6th series this split alone with Shadow that has been like, okay, BLG have a pretty decent lead. They're in a decent spot. Oh, the game is over. They lost. lost because they didn't know what to do in the late game. This was their problem at MSI. This has been their problem all year long, and it's not gotten better. They're the exact same team that they came out of that MSI tournament as, and that's really frustrating because, quite frankly, there is no excuse for BLG not improving. Over the course of this year, they have made roster changes in the jungle position over and over again, going from Wei to Beichuan to Shadow. Like, they're just begging for someone to be able to come in and figure this out as a shot-calling maestro, and it's not working for this team, even though some of the individual performances have been fine. Shadow was pretty good in terms of his engages and his general gameplay here, but again, the macro is severely lacking, and from all we know, Shadow has been a very vocal member of BLG, really kind of making the shot calls. Knight continues to be really good, but they're putting him on things like Talia and Galio, and when this team is really struggling, you don't need your best player, arguably the best player in the LPL, on things like Talia and Galio. You want him to be able to control the game a bit more because everybody else has been inconsistent. I think Bin's been fine on the top side, not great, but fine. I think that there have been parts of this split where he's looked good, parts where he's looked bad. Most of it, he's just been average, which is really not ideal. I think On was really good in this series, but how much did that really affect anything? He's playing Karma in game number 2, and then dud of the series for me has to go to Elk. This guy had so much gold and so many resources, and he was constantly getting caught out and put in bad positions. It's his fault. Like, I'm tired of defending Elk. I was so high on this guy last year. You know I don't have any sort of anti-Elk bias. I wouldn't have been calling him the best AD carry in the world in 2024 if I thought, Elk's gameplay can never translate to being good. I just have to call it as I see it. His gameplay in 2025 has been severely lackluster. This guy's been nowhere near a top 3 AD carry in the LPL. I don't even think he's been in the conversation for it. I know other analysts and other LPL casters would disagree, but that's just where I've been at with Elk. I do not see it right now. All of the things that made him great last year are not there anymore. He's an okay 2v2 duelist this year. That was not the case last year. He was the best 2v2 player in the world. And just in terms of how many resources he could generate, his mid games were so aggressive. He was constantly stepping up with the rest of this team. That's all gone. Like, I don't even really know what to say. Elk feels like a shell of himself right now in terms of the way the game is being played, and Bilibili cannot figure out how to close. And part of that is that Elk hasn't been a super consistent hyper carry. I think Knight has to be the one that you put on these big carries in the back half of games because he is the only person on this team I trust to actually be able to win you anything. And that is a very scary place to be. But IG with a massive, massive victory to close out the regular season, just about as good as you could possibly close it out. They are the number 2 seed going into the playoffs, which is great because they get to pick their opponent, obviously, outside of the number 1 seed getting to choose whoever they want. It's a huge buff. It's a huge benefit, and I think IG are going to take full advantage of it. All right, but that is going to do it for this absolutely ginormous LPL Week 6 and Week 7 overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for the LPL regular season here in 2025. The summer split is done. It is only time for playoffs and play-ins at this point, which we will get to, but as you can see up on the screen, we've got a couple of things to talk about first. We've got a lot of things to go over at the end of this video. Hope you are strapped in. We start off by closing out the video here, the Week 6, Week 7 review with my Player of the Week and my Dud of the Week. Player of the Week, very obvious to me. This is going to go to the Shy in the top lane for Invictus. What an end to the regular season the Shy ended up having here. Really propelled himself into that number 1 top laner in the LPL conversation, and we'll talk about that a bit more later, but multiple series against multiple teams this week where he just absolutely dominated. There are 3 games up here, but I didn't even put the Gwen game. The scoreline wasn't quite as sexy with the 3-9 Gwen, but I mean, absolutely terrifying stuff against Weibo that he ended up destroying them on, but the Rumble, the Yorick, all of it this week, the Scion, all of it ended up looking really good. If the Shy's getting into like the peak the Shy form, or at the very least, like I'm going to try the Shy form, like 2023 version of him, then all of a sudden things look very, very different for Invictus, and he was dominant across this week, so he more than earned that Player of the Week nod. My honorable mentions, Knight, the mid laner for BLG. They weren't exactly perfect this week, but boy, they would have been significantly worse without him. He is so valuable to that team, more valuable than anybody else in the entire league to their own individual team. I firmly believe that. The other honorable mention, Xiao Qinghua, the mid laner for LGD, the best week he's ever had in the LPL, or at least the best video he's ever had here in the LPL. Unbelievable stuff from him. This is a guy who's really struggled at the tier 1 level and was looking like one of the weaker mid laners in the entire league at the beginning of this split. Turns out things are actually pretty good for him, and he's kind of on an upward trajectory, ended off really strong. Hopefully that ends up carrying through. He'll have a play-in series to kind of prove it, but Xiao Qinghua and Knight are my honorable mentions. And then my dud of the week is going to go, unfortunately, unfortunately to Junhao, the jungler for Ultra Prime. They were the team that I felt was the least competent throughout this week, and I think that that is an unfortunate place to be considering they are going in to a play-in stage, and Junhao, I think, really struggled because of that, but hopefully he can get his feet under him. A little bit of a thing here. If Jue had been slightly worse in that final series, he definitely would have gotten dud of the week. FPX was a nightmare, and Jue was likely the least valuable player on that team, but again, he was too good in that final series for me to give it to him, so it ended up landing on Junhao, who's my dud of the week, and the Shy, who is my player of the week. But that's gonna end the video, I guess, version of this, the week 6, week 7 version. Let's go ahead and get everything wrapped up before we jump into the play-in stage, and that is really headlined by my award picks, which you can see up on the screen now, my all-pro selections and my MVP selection. I've got the first team highlighted, and then second and third team are listed below them. We can go over the players and just kind of talk a little bit about why. If you've watched this video, you probably have a pretty good idea as to what I feel about a lot of these players. But my first team All-Pro that you can see highlighted in the top lane, it's the Shy. In the jungle, it's Kanavi. In the mid lane, it's Knight. In the AD carry role, it's Jackie Love. And in the support position, it's Kyle. I think these were the 5 best players in their own individual positions. I'll talk a bit about MVP here as well. Knight's name is highlighted because to me, Knight is the MVP of the summer split. I get that Bilibili really struggled down this stretch and honestly struggled at a ton of times throughout this split, but Knight carried that team so hard in basically every single one of their wins. I really mean it when I say I really don't believe there is anybody in the entire league who's more valuable to their team's success than Knight is, and he's so much better than every other mid laner in the league. To me, it was clear that Knight was my MVP. My second place MVP was Kanavi in the jungle. I think he was also really excellent for top esports and honestly ended the split even hotter than he started it. I think that there were a lot of question marks about whether or not Kanavi was going to be good again because he, underperformed in the playoffs so much. Well, here you go. He was excellent. Best jungler in the league by far, in my opinion. And then Jackie Love would have been my third place vote. I think those were the 3 best players. Jackie Love was kind of in the lead for this for a majority of the split, but I think he was a little bit less dominant throughout the back end of the split because his teammates started to take over, and so unfortunately just lost a bit of MVP momentum that ended up going to Knight and even to his teammate Kanavi. The Shy ends up filling out on the top side. To me, he was the obvious choice for first team All-Pro in the top lane after this week. It was really a toss-up before week 6 and week 7, but he really cemented himself as the top laner who had the best split when he really dominated these final 2 weeks more so than everybody else. And Kyle is still going to get it in the support position. I get that AL's really struggling, but especially watching tape, it's quite clear that he is just the best support in the league and that he was still doing everything he could to help out this team. There's just only so much you can do from the support position. And I'm saying it like this team is bad. They have a bye. They're a top 4 team. Like, they're not terrible or anything. They just underperformed expectations. So those are my first team. Second and third team are listed below. Flandra is second team and Breathe is third team for me in the top lane. This was really tough. I think there's one good top laner right now consistently in the LPL, and that is the Shy, at least throughout the performance we got in the regular season. Flandra, I think, had a couple of really good games. Same thing for Breathe, who was decently consistent. If you want 369 or Bin in one of these spots, I can understand that. I just don't think they were very good this regular season. 369 was solid, but a complete background player on that top esports team, and so I didn't really want to just give him points for being in the background, so I ended up going with Flandra and Breathe, who I felt were pretty big pieces to their individual teams. For the jungle, for me, I have Shadow as the second team, and then Nio as the third team. If you don't want to include Group Nirvana, players and teams, and I'll kind of give shout outs to Group Nirvana players, you can swap this out for somebody else like a Wei or most specifically a Tarzan if you wanted to put him here, but I just wanted to include all of them in one. I should shout out a Group Nirvana top laner while I'm here. Jung would probably be my top lane nomination for, all-pro Nirvana, if you wanted to put it like that. Like Jung, Sasa, ZDZ. I think those are the 3 that are really fighting it out over it. But I would give it to Jung. I think he had the most carry performances from his individual role. But Nio, to me, has to be considered an all-pro caliber player. Nobody elevated their team more than Nio did across this split. He really actively carried almost every game for them. He was just playing against terrible competition, so you can't possibly put him above third team, but I do think he was the 3rd most valuable, and I didn't really have a 3rd jungler I wanted to highlight all that much, and so Nio would be my Group Nirvana, all-pro. Unfortunately for Xiaohao, he kind of lost that at the end because Nio outplayed him in terms of the games they played against each other, but again, if you wanted a 3rd group ascend, Tarzan is the obvious one, but I think Wei is his name. I think he would also be a potential candidate here. Mid lane was pretty easy. Second team is Rookie. Third team is Cream. Xiaohu deserves to be on here as well. I think they were all kind of in the same boat for me. It's really just about who you prefer. I think Rookie to me was clear choice for second team. I think he had a ton of really good games and he was just kind of better than everybody else in terms of the team fighting, even if the stats don't necessarily reflect that. And then I went with Cream because I think he ended the season stronger than Xiaohu, but Cream versus Xiaohu, I think they had very similar splits. Cream is on a better team, so I ended up giving the nod to him for third team. team. AD carry, I have Gala at second team and Hope at third team. Hope was really good at being able to, keep up with the AL pace, and I think for the most part he just had good games. He's not necessarily pushing his team forward, but I do believe that he was more consistent than a lot of the other AD carries that would be fighting for this spot. And Gala, clear cut, was the second best AD carry in the league by the end of the split. I think especially for the second half, it wasn't really all that close, and with less competition in that position because there really aren't a lot of consistent pieces, it ends up falling on Gala to pretty easily be that second team player. And then second team for support is Hong, and third team is On. Hong was really close to getting first team, and quite frankly, if you want to give Hong first team, I think that that's totally fair, especially with how he ended the split. I ended up going with Kyle because I think his job was much harder, but up to you. I think Hong, Kyle, they're very similar. And then On ended up landing for third team. People are going to forget he had some terrific games in the first half of the split. I know we've kind of been leaning towards second half stuff because I think everybody was relatively inconsistent in the first half, but On was fantastic in the first half, just wasn't quite able to end as strongly. Again, supports weren't all that consistent, so he ends up landing that third team. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down below. I forgot to do the group Nirvanas for mid, AD carry, and support. So like I said, top lane would be Jung, jungle would be Nio, mid lane would be Doingbi. I think that's pretty obvious. The mid laner for Ninjas in Pyjamas, he was the best mid laner in group Nirvana. It wasn't particularly close. I think the AD carry for me would still go to 1xN. I know I'm kind of a 1xN hater on this channel, but that doesn't mean that I don't think he was valuable to his team. I just think he was way more valuable in the first half than he was in the second half, where he started to play a lot worse and people weren't talking about that. But AD carry in group Nirvana is not particularly strong. And then support, it's really down to two. I'm going to give it to Palkia, the support for Edward Gaming, but if you wanted to give it to YCX, the support for LGD, I think that that's entirely fair. I think he was also very good, and I think it should go to one of those two. So those are the group Nirvana picks, and that kind of rounds out my award picks. So appreciate you sticking around. If you are interested in kind of debating some of those picks, let me know in the comments. I'm very curious to know where I'm kind of with community sentiment and where some people maybe disagree with my takes. But that transitions nicely as an end to the regular season into the playoff format and the play-in stage, and we can preview these matchups very quickly. You can see the 4 teams listed at the bottom. Top Esports, Invictus Gaming, Bilibili Gaming, and Anyone's Legend are the 4 teams that automatically qualify for the playoffs by being the top 4 seeds. They are in order, so congratulations to TES for once again going into playoffs as the number 1 seed. We'll see if they can actually live up to it this time, as opposed to what they were in summer or in spring, but they get to choose their opponents in descending order. So TES will get to pick, their opponent that they want to face, and then Invictus, then BLG, and then AL gets stuck with whoever's left. And who are they choosing from? Well, the 4 play-in series that we are going to get. It's the teams that have not qualified out of Group Ascend, so the 4 teams that would not qualify out of Group Ascend, and the 4 best teams in Group Nirvana all facing off against each other in opposite seeding fashion. So 5th seed from Group Ascend faces the 4th seed from Group Nirvana. You get it. So we'll talk about who I expect to win in the series, starting with the closest matchup, FunPlus Phoenix versus Ninjas in Pyjamas. Right now, there is no reason to believe that NIP is not going to win this series. They looked like the best team in Group Nirvana, but I do want to say it's closer than it would have ever been before they signed Jeje. I really do believe that if they have enough time to get some scrims under them and can get comfortable, there is a world where Sheer, Jeje, Jachi, and Jue are more than good enough to be able to make the playoffs, and so do not count FPX out in this series. I think that it's very winnable, and I think that they will put up a good fight, but for now, I can't go against what I've seen on tape, and that means I'm going with Ninjas in Pyjamas. We've got Team WE taking on Edward Gaming, another very close one with a lot of fun storylines, not only 2 orgs that are historic against each other. It's very fun to see this rivalry continue into 2025, but players that came from other organizations, Monkey and Vampire, formerly of the Edward Gaming organization. Very fun to see that, but I gotta go with my boys. I gotta go with EDG. I just don't know if WE are in the form right now. Their win over AL is absolutely massive towards the end of the regular season, but if EDG play up to their own standards, they should be better in multiple roles, and I think that should be able to get them over the hump. A massive series here, in my opinion, for Xiaohao and for Monkey. Whichever jungler ends up being better there is in a very good spot. Then you got the ones that are a bit easier to predict. JD Gaming taking on LGD Gaming. As bad as JDG have been, they have clearly been better than the bottom teams in Group Ascend, in FPX and WE, and I think those teams are better than LGD, and so I think JDG shouldn't have a ton of problems being able to get themselves into playoffs. Now, what do I think they'll do there? Not much, but I think JDG should be good enough to take down LGD. I'm not sure the young upstarts have enough power to get into the playoffs here, and it's even more the case for Weibo Gaming taking on Ultra Prime. This should not be difficult under any circumstance. Ultra Prime is not a particularly good team. Weibo Gaming genuinely is a good team. It's just the LPL is a bit top 4-y right now. So my predictions are Weibo, JDG, Edward Gaming, and Ninjas in Pyjamas to get into playoffs. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering all of the LPL playoffs as per usual on this channel. Play-ins, playoffs, and then worlds when it comes around, all of that great stuff. But we cover all 3 of the other major regions every single week on this channel as well. LTA North, LEC, LCK, everything in LoL Esports. We're even covering NACL every single week, who are in their own playoffs. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. You guys know I've been casting for LPL English. I've only talked about it multiple times throughout this video, but I'll actually be on the first play-in series as the color commentator alongside Mazel. It will be Weibo Gaming versus Ultra Prime, I believe, but whichever one it is, it's the first play-in series that I will be live on for. You can check out the links in the description for the YouTube and the Twitch for LPL English if you want to check out my live cast. While that's going on, it'll give you a bit of a sneak preview for what I'm going to talk about in my next video, but if you're interested in all of that LPL stuff, LPL English is obviously the place to go to watch it. YouTube, again, YouTube and Twitch are down below, but with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.